Welcome to Midnight History, where the forgotten truths of the past come to life. Throughout Europe and Asia, kings and emperors alike shared one universal fear: poison. A single sip or bite could end a dynasty, topple a throne, and rewrite history in an instant. In an age where betrayal often came from the closest advisors, rulers relied on a silent line of defense: the royal food taster. This profession was the monarch's life insurance. Yet for the one doing the tasting, it was a deadly gamble. Every meal placed before them could conceal the fatal ambition of an enemy. Imagine sitting at a lavish banquet, knowing the exquisite dishes might be your last. You take a bite not for pleasure, but for survival, the monarch's, not your own. Have you ever imagined what it's like when every meal feels like playing the lottery with death? Thomas Gray lived that reality. As a royal food taster in the turbulent courts of medieval England, his every heartbeat carried the weight of a nation's future. Once again, if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so we have more motivation to produce better quality products. Poison, in the world of monarchs, was the invisible specter that haunted every royal banquet, council meeting, and quiet moment of solitude. Unlike the clash of swords on a battlefield or the roar of siege engines at castle walls, poison was silent, insidious, and virtually unstoppable once delivered. Kings, queens, and emperors across the ancient and medieval world knew that poison could bypass even the thickest fortress walls, the most loyal guard, and the most sophisticated political schemes. It was quite simply the assassin's perfect weapon. The victim rarely saw it coming. Often, they never even knew they had been targeted until the slow grip of death began to take hold. For this reason alone, rulers became almost obsessively paranoid about the threat, and history is filled with chilling examples that justify their fears. Consider the court of ancient Rome, where ambition and treachery intertwined like poisonous vines. Few stories capture the terror of poison more vividly than that of Emperor Claudius and his infamous wife, Agrippina the Younger. Claudius, a man who was often underestimated due to his physical infirmities and mild demeanor, had risen to the imperial throne after the assassination of his predecessor, Caligula. He was not particularly popular with the Roman elite, who regarded him as weak and indecisive, and he surrounded himself with advisors who were often more cunning than loyal. Among the most dangerous of these was Agrippina, who had married Claudius not purely out of affection, but as a calculated step toward securing power for her son Nero. Agrippina's ambition was legendary, and her cruelty knew no bounds. She understood the power of appearances, often presenting herself as the dutiful empress while secretly plotting the downfall of those who stood in her way. Claudius, aging and perhaps aware of his precarious position, had begun to express doubts about Nero's suitability as his heir. These doubts threatened Agrippina's carefully constructed plans, and for a woman as ruthless as she was, the solution was obvious: Claudius had to die. But how could she eliminate the emperor without provoking suspicion? The answer was poison. Unlike open assassination, which might lead to political upheaval and civil war, poison could be administered quietly and leave little evidence behind. According to Roman historians such as Tacitus and Suetonius, Agrippina enlisted the help of Locusta, a notorious poisoner who specialized in crafting toxins that could kill discreetly. Claudius's final meal was said to have been laced with a slow-acting poison hidden within a plate of mushrooms, a dish he particularly loved. As he ate, Claudius suspected nothing, savoring what he thought was a simple delicacy, even as death coursed silently through his veins. The emperor's decline was horrifying and undignified. Some accounts suggest that Agrippina, impatient for the poison to work, called in his physician, who instead of saving him administered an additional dose to hasten his end. Claudius died in agony, leaving Nero, Agrippina's son, to ascend the throne. For the Romans, the lesson was clear. Even the emperor, surrounded by guards, servants, and advisors, was not safe from a single dish prepared with murderous intent. This story, one of countless examples in ancient history, illustrates why kings and rulers were consumed by the fear of poison. It was a weapon that struck not only the body but also the mind, for its mere possibility made rulers question the loyalty of everyone around them. Unlike a sword or arrow, which was visible and could be defended against, poison could come from the hands of a trusted friend, a family member, or even a servant who had been bribed or coerced. The paranoia it created was a powerful force, and many monarchs found themselves unable to eat or drink without imagining that each sip of wine might be their last. The fear was not confined to Rome. Across Europe and Asia, rulers developed elaborate precautions to avoid the unseen threat. In medieval courts, tasters were employed to sample every dish and drink before it reached the monarch's lips, acting as human test shields, whose lives were expendable in the name of royal safety. The concept was as brutal as it was practical. If the taster died, the king would live. This arrangement provided little comfort, however, because a clever poisoner might use a slow-acting toxin that allowed the taster to survive long enough to assure the king the food was safe, only for both to die hours later. In Byzantine Constantinople, emperors developed a near-pathological suspicion of poison. Their courts became notorious for endless layers of security surrounding their meals. Every ingredient was sourced from trusted suppliers, and the kitchens were watched over like sacred temples. Servants were searched, monitored, and sometimes even locked inside until the emperor had finished eating. It was common for rulers to commission alchemists and physicians to create antidotes, universal cures that could counteract any toxin, though these concoctions were more superstition than science. Some emperors went so far as to dose themselves regularly with tiny amounts of suspected poisons, hoping to build an immunity, a practice that was as dangerous as it was desperate. The same paranoia stretched eastward to the courts of the Persian Shahs and the Chinese emperors, where poison was equally feared and equally common. In the imperial palaces of China, where hundreds of concubines, eunuchs, and advisors vied for influence, poisoning was a weapon of choice. The emperor's kitchens became fortresses of ritual and control. Food was stored under lock and key, and multiple tasters were used for each dish. Dishes were sometimes prepared in separate kitchens, each responsible for only a single ingredient, so that no one person could tamper with the entire meal. These elaborate measures did little to ease the psychological burden of constant suspicion. For kings and emperors, the act of eating became a performance fraught with tension. Each bite was scrutinized by those watching for signs of distress, and even the most sumptuous feasts were shadowed by the possibility of betrayal. This fear often drove rulers to extremes. Some refused to eat in public, isolating themselves in their private chambers for meals. Others developed peculiar habits, such as insisting that their dishes be prepared in their presence or tasting from the plates of their courtiers as a grim test of loyalty. The obsession with poison was not merely a matter of personal safety. It was also a reflection of the fragile nature of power. Monarchs understood that their lives were tied to the stability of their kingdoms. A single death could plunge a nation into chaos, spark succession crises, or invite foreign invasions. Poison, with its ability to strike silently and decisively, became the perfect tool for ambitious rivals seeking to reshape the political landscape. This is why rulers invested so heavily in precautions, and why the profession of the royal food taster became so important. Yet for all their precautions, kings could never completely escape the fear. Poison was an enemy they could not see or predict, and it eroded their trust in everyone around them. Even family members were not exempt from suspicion. History is filled with tales of sons poisoning fathers, brothers poisoning brothers, and wives poisoning husbands, all in the ruthless pursuit of power. This constant undercurrent of distrust shaped royal courts into places of cold calculation, where genuine affection was rare and alliances were often temporary. The psychological toll was immense. Imagine waking each morning knowing that your survival might depend on the loyalty of a cook, a servant, or a distant cousin with a claim to your throne. Imagine sitting down to a meal surrounded by lavish dishes and realizing that any one of them could conceal your death. This was the reality for kings and emperors, and it explains why poison held such a unique place in their nightmares. The story of Agrippina and Claudius is but one illustration of how poison could change the course of history. Without Claudius's death, Nero might never have come to power, and the subsequent years of tyranny, rebellion, and civil war might have been avoided. Similar stories can be found in nearly every royal lineage, from the pharaohs of Egypt to the Maharajas of India. The common thread is that poison was not simply a method of assassination. It was a tool of political strategy, wielded with precision and malice. This fear did not fade with time. In the medieval period, the use of poison remained widespread, and the measures taken to avoid it became even more elaborate. Kings invested in silver goblets, which were believed to change color in the presence of certain toxins. They employed apothecaries to test their food and drink using rudimentary chemical methods, and they often kept antidotes close at hand. Some monarchs, like Mithridates VI of Pontus, became so obsessed with the threat that they experimented on themselves with various poisons and antidotes, believing that they could achieve complete immunity. Mithridates' methods were extreme, involving the ingestion of increasingly lethal doses of toxins over time. While his approach may have made him somewhat resistant to certain poisons, it also left him paranoid and isolated, living in a constant state of vigilance. This culture of fear permeated every level of the royal household. Servants were often subjected to intense scrutiny, and accusations of poisoning could lead to swift and brutal punishment, sometimes without trial. In many cases, individuals were executed simply because they had been in proximity to the king's food, their guilt assumed rather than proven. This atmosphere of suspicion bred cruelty and mistrust, making royal courts dangerous places not just for the monarch, but for everyone within them. What is particularly unsettling about poison is its democratizing nature. Unlike armies or fortresses, which required vast resources, poison could be acquired and used by almost anyone with the will and cunning to do so. A single servant armed with a vial of toxin could topple a dynasty, and this knowledge gnawed at the minds of rulers. They could defend themselves against invading armies with soldiers and walls, but how could they defend against a drop of poison slipped into their wine? For the monarchs of Europe and Asia, the answer was often to rely on others, on tasters, guards, and elaborate systems of surveillance, to act as shields against the invisible threat. But even these measures offered only a fragile sense of security. The reality was that no king could ever be completely safe. The fear of poison was woven into the very fabric of royal life, influencing decisions, shaping policies, and often leading to rash and destructive actions. It is easy, from a modern perspective, to view these fears as excessive or irrational. Yet when we look at the historical record, it becomes clear that the threat was real and ever-present. The deaths of emperors, kings, and princes by poison are too numerous to dismiss as mere paranoia. In a world where power was often concentrated in the hands of a single individual, the ability to eliminate that individual silently and without open conflict was a temptation few could resist. The legacy of this fear is visible even today in the way we think about leadership and vulnerability. The image of the paranoid king, peering suspiciously at his goblet before taking a sip, is a powerful reminder of the precarious nature of power. Poison, as a weapon, embodies the idea that the mightiest can be brought low by the smallest and most unassuming of threats. And so, kings remained obsessed, their lives shaped by a danger they could neither see nor control. Poison was the shadow that followed them everywhere, a constant reminder that trust was a luxury they could not afford. It made their meals joyless, their relationships strained, and their courts places of ceaseless intrigue. The fear of poison was not merely about survival. It was about the realization that their power, no matter how vast, was ultimately fragile. This is why rulers from Claudius in ancient Rome to the emperors of China and the kings of medieval Europe invested so heavily in precautions. This is why they surrounded themselves with tasters, apothecaries, and guards. And this is why the role of the royal food taster became one of the most simultaneously trusted and expendable positions in the royal household. To the monarch, the taster was a living barrier between life and death, a human shield against the unseen enemy. But as we will see in the coming segments, this grim profession was far from glamorous. The life of a royal food taster was a daily confrontation with mortality, and while kings hoped it would keep them safe, it was a fragile safeguard at best. In the world of monarchs, poison remained the ultimate terror, invisible, unpredictable, and devastatingly effective. It is no wonder that kings were so obsessed with it, for the mere thought of poison could unmake even the most powerful ruler from within, eroding his confidence and leaving him at the mercy of forces he could not control. The story of poison is as old as civilization itself, a shadowy thread woven into the tapestry of human history. From the earliest days of human conflict, when survival often depended on cunning as much as strength, poison was recognized as a weapon of extraordinary potential. It required no armies, no siege engines, no grand displays of power. A single, well-timed dose could eliminate a rival, dismantle a dynasty, or change the course of history. This is why the evolution of poison over time reads like a grim chronicle of humanity's ingenuity in the service of cruelty. It began in nature, with the plants, fungi, and animal-derived toxins readily available to early societies, and it eventually transformed into the secretive, methodical practice of chemical refinement. With every generation, poisoners grew more skilled, their creations deadlier, and rulers correspondingly more paranoid. In the earliest periods, the sources of poison were the natural world's most dangerous secrets. Primitive societies learned to harness lethal plants and mushrooms, either through trial and error or through carefully guarded traditions passed down among shamans and herbalists. Some of the first poisons likely came from plants like hemlock, aconite, and deadly nightshade, all of which contained powerful alkaloids capable of shutting down the body's vital systems. The ancient Greeks famously used hemlock to execute condemned prisoners, with the philosopher Socrates being its most notable victim. The poison worked slowly, paralyzing the muscles from the feet upward until the condemned could no longer breathe, a death as methodical as it was inevitable. Mushrooms, too, played a dark role. The death-cap mushroom, indistinguishable to the untrained eye from edible varieties, could devastate the liver and kidneys, causing excruciating pain before the victim succumbed. These natural toxins were terrifying because they were invisible to the senses, no bitter taste, no obvious signs of tampering, and because they could be concealed in seemingly harmless food or drink. Over time, societies discovered even more insidious sources of poison. In ancient India, China, and Mesopotamia, poisoners experimented with snake venom, scorpion toxins, and even the secretions of poisonous frogs. These substances could be applied to weapons or mixed into meals, and they became the hallmark of assassinations intended to leave little evidence. The Assyrians, feared for their ruthless tactics, were said to have dipped arrows in venom before battle, ensuring that even a minor wound would prove fatal. In China, entire treatises were devoted to the art of gu, a form of poison-making that combined the venom of multiple creatures in sealed containers, allowing them to devour one another until a single, extraordinarily toxic substance remained. The resulting concoction could kill in minute doses, and its preparation was shrouded in superstition and secrecy. As civilizations advanced, so too did their knowledge of chemistry, and poison-making began to move beyond simple extracts from plants and animals. In the classical world, alchemists and early scientists experimented with minerals, salts, and metals, discovering substances that could wreak havoc on the human body. Arsenic, sometimes called the king of poisons, emerged as one of the most feared substances of the ancient and medieval worlds. Tasteless and odorless when dissolved in food or drink, it was virtually impossible to detect with the tools available at the time. Chronic exposure could mimic the symptoms of common illnesses, such as dysentery or tuberculosis, allowing assassins to hide their crimes behind a veil of natural causes. It became a favorite weapon of ambitious courtiers and scheming relatives, and the paranoia surrounding arsenic shaped royal courts for centuries. Arsenic was far from the only mineral poison in circulation. Mercury, lead, and antimony were also used, often with devastating effect. Mercury, in particular, had a strange allure because it was sometimes prescribed as a medicine despite its toxicity. And scrupulous poisoners exploited this ambiguity, presenting mercury-laced concoctions as cures that ultimately killed their victims. Lead and antimony were similarly insidious, as they could be administered over time in small doses that slowly undermined the victim's health. These poisons were not quick or dramatic, but their gradual nature made them perfect for situations where the perpetrator needed to avoid suspicion. A ruler who wasted away over weeks or months could easily be declared a victim of natural decline, leaving the assassin free to seize power without fear of reprisal. By the medieval period, poison-making had become an art form as much as a science. Europe's courts were rife with rumors of professional poisoners, men and women who could be hired to eliminate rivals for a price. Secretive guilds were rumored to exist, sharing closely guarded formulas for toxins that could mimic diseases, kill without leaving a trace, or cause death at a precisely chosen moment. Whether these guilds truly existed or were the product of collective paranoia hardly mattered. The fear of their existence was enough to breed suspicion at every royal table. Italy, with its fragmented city-states and endless political intrigue, became particularly infamous for poisonings. Families like the Borgias earned reputations for using poison as a political tool, though the extent of these accusations remains debated by historians. Still, the rumors alone were enough to make others believe that poison had become the ultimate weapon of the powerful and the ambitious. The refinement of poisons also deepened their psychological impact. Because the substances were often undetectable, victims could be lulled into a false sense of security, eating and drinking as usual until the toxin began its work. The symptoms were often ambiguous, leading physicians to misdiagnose the cause or even inadvertently worsen the victim's condition by prescribing treatments that interacted with the poison. This ambiguity was exactly what made poison so frightening. It was not simply a tool of murder, but a weapon that could erode trust, disrupt the natural order, and leave everyone, from monarchs to commoners, wondering who might be plotting their demise. In Asia, poison-making followed its own dark trajectory. The Chinese imperial court, already mentioned for its elaborate security measures, was deeply familiar with a variety of toxic substances derived from plants and minerals. Arsenic and mercury were well known, but so too were exotic toxins like aconitine, derived from the monkshood plant, and strychnine, extracted from the seeds of the strychnus tree. These poisons were not only deadly, but often caused convulsions, seizures, and other horrifying symptoms that could terrify onlookers and serve as a warning to potential challengers. In India, knowledge of poisons was codified in ancient texts such as the Arthashastra, which described in meticulous detail how rulers might use poison to eliminate enemies or protect themselves from assassination. The text even included instructions for creating vishakanyas, or poison maidens, young women allegedly raised from birth on tiny doses of poison so that their very bodies became lethal to those they touched or kissed. While the existence of these maidens may be more legend than reality, the idea alone reveals the level of fear and fascination surrounding poison in ancient societies. The Islamic world, with its rich tradition of alchemy and medicine, also contributed to the evolution of poison. Scholars and alchemists in the Abbasid Caliphate and beyond experimented with distillation and crystallization techniques, allowing them to isolate potent compounds from natural sources. This increased the purity and lethality of their poisons, and it made the substances easier to conceal in food, drink, or cosmetics. Perfumes and ointments, for example, could be infused with deadly toxins that absorbed through the skin, turning even an innocent touch into a potential death sentence. These innovations only intensified the paranoia of rulers, who began to view every object in their environment as a possible weapon. The Renaissance and early modern periods saw further advances in chemistry, and with them came even more sophisticated poisons. European alchemists, driven by both curiosity and patronage from wealthy nobles, developed compounds that could kill swiftly or slowly, depending on the assassin's needs. The infamous inheritance powder, used in Italy, a euphemism for arsenic, was believed to be capable of eliminating inconvenient relatives with remarkable efficiency. Because arsenic could be administered in small, repeated doses, the victim might appear to die of natural causes, allowing the perpetrator to inherit titles and lands without raising suspicion. This practice became so notorious that the Catholic Church eventually established special tribunals to investigate suspicious deaths, though their efforts were often hampered by the lack of reliable forensic methods. Even as scientific understanding expanded, poison-making remained cloaked in secrecy. Recipes were often passed down orally or recorded in coded texts to prevent them from falling into the wrong hands, or to protect the poisoner's monopoly. This secrecy fed the growing sense of paranoia among rulers, who could never be sure how many deadly substances existed or who might possess them. The fear was compounded by the fact that poisons could be delivered in countless ways: sprinkled on clothing, hidden in a jeweled ring, smeared on a letter, or mixed into a favorite dish. No precaution seemed adequate when the threat could come from anywhere. The fear of poison reached almost absurd levels in some courts. Monarchs employed teams of apothecaries whose sole task was to prepare and test antidotes, though these were often ineffective. Food tasters became standard fixtures in royal households, sampling every dish and drink before the ruler dared to partake. Some rulers, like France's Louis XIV, insisted on dining in highly controlled environments where every utensil, plate, and ingredient was accounted for. Others took more extreme measures, retreating into isolation and trusting no one. Yet despite these precautions, poisonings continued to claim the lives of kings, queens, and nobles, proving that no amount of vigilance could fully eliminate the danger. By the 18th and 19th centuries, poisons had become even more potent with the advent of industrial chemistry. Substances like cyanide and thallium entered the assassin's toolkit, offering rapid and reliable means of killing. Cyanide, in particular, was terrifying because of its speed. A single dose could kill within minutes, leaving little opportunity for intervention. Thallium, on the other hand, was valued for its slow action and the difficulty of detecting it. These modern poisons made the role of the food taster even more precarious, as the line between survival and death became thinner than ever. The secretive nature of poison-making throughout history magnified the sense of paranoia it inspired. Unlike open warfare, or even clandestine plots involving weapons, poison required no direct confrontation. It could be prepared in secret, administered in private, and blamed on natural causes. The knowledge of its existence was enough to keep rulers awake at night, scanning their surroundings for signs of betrayal. Every cough, every bout of nausea, every unexplained illness could be a harbinger of death, and this constant anxiety shaped the way monarchs interacted with their families, advisors, and servants. What makes the evolution of poison particularly unsettling is how it mirrors humanity's broader technological progress. As societies became more advanced, their poisons became more refined, more effective, and more difficult to detect. Each leap forward in chemistry brought new opportunities for murderers and new fears for those in power. This dynamic created a self-perpetuating cycle of innovation and paranoia. The more effective poisons became, the more elaborate the countermeasures grew, and the more determined poisoners were to overcome them. For the kings and queens who lived under the shadow of poison, the danger was never abstract. It was as real as the plate of food before them, as tangible as the cup of wine at their lips. They knew that their enemies might strike not with armies, but with a pinch of powder or a drop of liquid, and this knowledge shaped every aspect of their lives. Meals were no longer occasions for pleasure, but rituals of survival. Relationships were tainted by suspicion, as even a beloved spouse could be a potential assassin. Power, for all its privileges, came with the constant awareness that it could be snatched away in an instant by something as small as a grain of poison. This evolution of poison over time also reveals much about the darker aspects of human nature. The willingness to use such a weapon speaks to a desire for control, for the ability to eliminate obstacles without risk or public scrutiny. Poison is a weapon of the patient and the calculating, the kind of individuals who value subtlety over spectacle. It is no wonder that poisoners have often been depicted as shadowy figures, lurking in the margins of history, their deeds leaving little trace beyond the corpses they create. As we move forward in this story, it becomes clear why rulers clung so desperately to the practice of employing food tasters and apothecaries, why they devised increasingly elaborate systems of security around their meals. The evolution of poison was not just a story of chemical refinement, but of growing psychological terror. Each new substance, each new method of delivery, deepened the sense of vulnerability felt by those at the top of society's hierarchy. It was not enough to be powerful. One had to be perpetually vigilant, always watching for the invisible threat that could end everything. And so, as poison evolved from crude plant extracts to sophisticated chemical compounds, so too did the paranoia it inspired. It was a fear that transcended cultures and eras, binding together emperors in China, sultans in the Middle East, kings in Europe, and rulers across the globe. The unseen threat of poison reminded them all that power was fragile, that trust could be fatal, and that death might be lurking in the next cup of wine or the next bite of bread. For the monarchs who lived with this knowledge, life became a delicate balancing act between indulgence and survival, a daily performance in which every meal might be their last. The royal court was a place that glittered with wealth, ceremony, and the trappings of power, but beneath the polished veneer lurked something darker, a constant undercurrent of suspicion and fear. Nowhere was this tension more palpable than at a royal banquet, where the most sumptuous of meals could easily conceal a lethal threat. It was at Windsor Castle, the heart of English monarchy, that young Thomas Grey first truly understood the danger that accompanied life at court. A former soldier, barely into his 20s, Thomas had not yet been hardened by years of service in the royal household. He had been chosen for a task that filled even the most seasoned court servants with dread. He would be the king's official food taster. His job was deceptively simple: sample every dish before it was placed before the monarch to ensure it was not poisoned. Yet Thomas quickly realized that this duty was, in essence, a daily gamble with his own life, and his first night of service would plunge him headlong into the suffocating paranoia that haunted Windsor Castle. The banquet hall was a cathedral of stone and shadow, its high vaulted ceiling lost in the flickering glow of hundreds of candles. Golden chandeliers swung gently with the draft from the open doors, scattering light across long tables groaning under the weight of roasted meats, sugared fruits, crusted pies, and spiced wine. The air was heavy with the mingled scents of venison, cinnamon, and beeswax, so rich it was almost cloying. Courtiers in embroidered doublets and shimmering gowns moved through the hall with rehearsed grace, their soft voices carrying the practiced tones of politeness that masked deeper rivalries. Everywhere Thomas looked, there was splendor. Polished silver goblets, tapestries depicting the conquests of long-dead kings, and the imposing figure of the monarch himself seated at the dais, draped in ermine and velvet. But behind this opulence lay a suffocating tension, the unspoken understanding that the feast might hold more than mere indulgence. In the royal court, even the most lavish meal could be a weapon. Thomas, dressed plainly in the livery of a royal servant, stood stiffly near the king's table, his heart hammering as the first course was brought forth. The heavy doors of the kitchen swung open, and a small army of servants emerged, each bearing dishes so artfully arranged they looked more like offerings to a god than food for a man. He watched them approach as though they carried death itself, for each platter represented a test he would have to endure. At his signal, the first dish was set before him, and the entire hall seemed to hold its breath. He picked up the silver fork, his hand trembling only slightly, and speared a bite of venison dripping with red wine sauce. The rich, savory flavor filled his mouth, but Thomas barely tasted it. He chewed slowly, swallowed, and waited. The silence was unbearable. Hundreds of eyes were fixed on him, some anxious, some curious, others cold and calculating. He knew that many in the hall harbored ambitions that would be greatly served by the king's death. To them, Thomas was little more than a barrier standing between themselves and the throne. He could feel the weight of their stares pressing down on him as he waited for any sign of illness. Sweating, cramping, the telltale burning in the throat. None came, at least not yet. When he finally stepped aside and allowed the dish to be served to the king, a murmur of voices rippled through the hall, a release of the tension that had settled like a thick fog. But Thomas knew this was only the beginning. There were many more courses to come. As the banquet continued, Thomas moved mechanically from dish to dish, tasting each one before it reached the king's table. Roasted fowl stuffed with herbs, gilded marzipan shaped like mythical beasts, fish cooked in fragrant sauces. All passed through his lips before they reached their intended recipient. The food was exquisite, the finest in the kingdom, yet to Thomas it was little more than potential poison. Each bite felt like a betrayal of instinct, the deliberate ingestion of danger. He had once faced armed men on the battlefield, but this was far worse. There, the threat had been visible, tangible. Here, death might come hidden in honey or masked by a pinch of spice, and he would not see it coming until it was too late. Whispers drifted through the hall, carried on the perfumed air like ghostly echoes. He caught fragments as he passed. Arsenic in the sauce. The Duchess would gain everything. His cousin was seen near the kitchens. The words burrowed into his mind, fueling the paranoia that already gnawed at his nerves. He knew that much of it was idle gossip, the court's favorite pastime, but some of it could be true. He had been told in hushed tones before the banquet that the king had enemies both inside and outside the court, that more than one attempt on his life had been foiled in recent months. Thomas did not doubt it. The royal court was the perfect breeding ground for assassination, a place where ambition and resentment fermented in the shadows and where the smallest act of treachery could be disguised as chance misfortune. As Thomas sampled a slice of honey-glazed pheasant, his eyes flicked to the nobles seated nearby. There was the Duke of Somerset, his heavy-lidded gaze betraying nothing but boredom, though Thomas had heard rumors that he had secretly pledged allegiance to a foreign power. Next to him sat the Lady Eleanor, a woman whose beauty masked a reputation for ruthless cunning. She smiled as though this banquet were the most delightful of affairs, yet her eyes glittered with something harder than mirth. Across the hall, a cluster of younger courtiers whispered behind jeweled hands, their expressions carefully neutral when Thomas's gaze met theirs. Each of these people, he realized, could be the one who had arranged for poison to be slipped into the king's food. Or perhaps it was none of them. Perhaps it was one of the cooks, bribed with promises of gold or land. Perhaps it was a servant like himself, coerced by threats against his family. The weight of that thought was crushing. He understood now why his role existed. By tasting the king's food, he became the first line of defense, the human shield meant to intercept any attempt at assassination. It was a grim and thankless task, one that left him feeling both expendable and essential. He was, in the eyes of the court, a necessary sacrifice, a man whose life was worth less than the king's, but whose death would serve as a warning. If Thomas were to collapse mid-banquet, clutching his throat as poison consumed him, the king might be spared. Yet Thomas found little comfort in this knowledge. The courses continued to arrive, each more elaborate than the last, and with each bite Thomas felt the invisible noose tighten around his neck. The hall's atmosphere grew heavier as the evening wore on, the laughter forced, the conversation strained. Everyone was watching, waiting for something to happen. The king, though outwardly calm, cast furtive glances at Thomas each time he raised a goblet or fork to his lips, as though silently asking for reassurance. Thomas, of course, could offer none. He could only keep eating, keep swallowing, and hope that he would live long enough to see the banquet's end. At one point, as he tasted a dish of stewed pears spiced with cloves, Thomas thought he detected an odd bitterness, a faint metallic tang that did not belong. His heart lurched, his breath caught in his throat, and for a moment he was certain that this was it, that his first night as food taster would also be his last. But the sensation passed as quickly as it had come, leaving only the sour taste of fear on his tongue. He glanced at the steward standing nearby, but the man's expression was unreadable. The dish was served to the king, who ate it without incident, and Thomas forced himself to move on, though his hands shook more noticeably now. As the final course was brought forth, a towering confection of candied fruits and almond paste sculpted into the shape of Windsor Castle itself. The hall seemed to exhale in collective relief. Thomas sampled the dessert, his jaw aching from the strain of constant vigilance, and once again he survived. The king smiled faintly as the sweet was set before him, though Thomas could see the exhaustion in his eyes. It was the same exhaustion Thomas felt in his bones, the weariness of living with the knowledge that any moment could bring death. When the banquet finally concluded and the courtiers drifted away, leaving only the servants to clear the wreckage of the feast, Thomas found himself alone in the quiet hall. The golden light of the candles had dimmed, casting long shadows across the floor. He sank onto a bench, his legs trembling, and stared at the empty dishes arrayed before him. He had tasted them all, one by one, and lived. But the victory felt hollow. He knew that tomorrow would bring another banquet, another round of dishes, another round of whispers. The court would continue its endless games of power, and he would remain caught in the middle, the silent guardian of the king's life. In that moment, Thomas realized that he had entered a world where trust was a luxury no one could afford. The royal court was not the glittering sanctuary it appeared to be. It was a nest of vipers, each waiting for the chance to strike. And he, Thomas Gray, was now part of it. He would walk the halls of Windsor Castle with the knowledge that danger lurked behind every smiling face, and that his own survival depended on his ability to endure the constant fear that came with his position. As he rose to leave the hall, the faint echoes of laughter and whispers still clinging to the stone walls, he could not help but wonder how long he would last. The royal court was the perfect breeding ground for assassination, a place where ambition, greed, and hatred simmered just beneath the surface. For Thomas, that first night as the king's food taster was a baptism by fire, a harsh introduction to a life in which every meal could be his last. He had seen the calculating glances, heard the murmured rumors, and felt the weight of the court's suspicion pressing down on him like an invisible hand. There was no escape from it now. He was bound to this role, bound to this world of secrets and shadows, and the only certainty was that one mistake, one moment of carelessness, could cost him everything. As he stepped out into the cold night air beyond the banquet hall, Thomas drew in a deep breath, savoring the sharpness of it in his lungs. He was alive for now, but the knowledge that his life hung by a thread was inescapable. The court's splendor had already begun to lose its luster, revealing the rot beneath, and Thomas could not help but feel that he had stepped into a game he could never truly win. Somewhere within Windsor Castle, perhaps even among those he had seen smiling across the banquet table, there were those who dreamed of the king's death. And it would be Thomas's duty, day after day, to stand between them and their goal, knowing full well that one day, inevitably, he might fail. This was the reality of life at the royal court, a place where loyalty was a mask and survival was never guaranteed. Thomas Gray, once a soldier accustomed to the clarity of battle, would now navigate a battlefield of whispers and glances, of poisoned wine and gilded daggers. His first night as the king's taster had shown him the stakes, and though he could not yet fully grasp the danger he was in, he understood enough to know that the days ahead would test not only his courage but his very will to live. Thomas Gray's initiation into the life of a royal food taster did not end with the banquet. If anything, the banquet had merely been a carefully orchestrated introduction, a demonstration of the suffocating reality in which he would now exist. After the last goblet had been drained and the gilded platters cleared away, Thomas had been summoned to a small, cold chamber near the kitchens, a room with bare stone walls and a single flickering torch that cast jagged shadows across the floor. There, he was met by the king's steward, a gaunt, hollow-eyed man named Sir Alaric Hensley, who regarded Thomas with all the warmth of a butcher surveying a lamb. "You are the king's meat shield," Alaric said flatly, wasting no time with ceremony. His voice carried the rasp of a man who had spent decades breathing in the dust and fumes of court life, and his eyes, small, sharp, and calculating, never left Thomas's face. "You will taste the food before His Majesty does. If you live, the king will eat. If you die, well, your service will have been appreciated." There was no trace of sympathy in the steward's tone, only the weary resignation of someone who had given this speech many times before. Thomas, still pale from the ordeal of the banquet, opened his mouth to speak, but found no words came. The reality of his situation pressed down on him like the weight of the castle itself. He had known the role was dangerous, everyone did. But to hear it described so bluntly, as if his life was nothing more than a disposable buffer for the king's safety, was a shock he had not been prepared for. "You should understand something else," Alaric continued, pacing slowly around the room. "You are not merely at risk from poison. There are stories, tales of tasters who fell ill from poisoned pies or sweetmeats laced with arsenic. That is the obvious danger. But there have also been others who were accused of treachery, of conspiring to poison the king themselves. They were executed, of course, publicly. Their families were shamed, their names erased from the rolls. So do not think for a moment that you can grow complacent or careless. You must perform your duties with absolute precision. One mistake, and you will not be buried with honors. You will be hanged like a common criminal." Thomas felt his stomach twist as the steward spoke. He had been a soldier once, accustomed to risk and hardship, but at least in battle there had been clarity, friend and foe, victory and defeat. Here, there was nothing but uncertainty, the gnawing knowledge that his life could end without warning. The idea of dying from poison was terrifying enough, but the thought of being accused of treachery, of being dragged through the streets and executed as a traitor, was worse. He tried to imagine the faces of the tasters who had met such fates, nameless men who had stood where he now stood, only to be cut down by forces they could not control. "Do you understand your duty?" Alaric asked, stopping directly in front of Thomas. "Yes," Thomas managed to reply, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Good," the steward said, though his expression betrayed no satisfaction. "Then remember this. The king's life is worth more than yours. That is not a judgment. It is a fact. You will taste his food, and you will do it without hesitation. If you die, the king will live. That is the purpose of your existence now. Do not forget it." The profession of food taster, Thomas realized, was not born of honor or tradition, but of cold necessity. Poison had always been the unseen terror of monarchs, and the only way to guard against it was to place another human being between the king and death. It was as simple as that. The practice dated back centuries, long before Thomas was born, to the days when rulers feared betrayal from their closest advisors and even their own kin. He had heard whispers of ancient kings in Rome and Persia who had employed slaves or prisoners to sample their meals, discarding them without a second thought if they perished. Over time, the role had become institutionalized, refined into a formal position within the royal household. Yet the essence remained unchanged. The taster was a living shield, a tool to be used and, if necessary, sacrificed. Alaric, perhaps sensing Thomas's growing dread, began to recount some of the more infamous stories from the castle's history. "There was Edmund Reeves," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "He was a taster under King Richard's father. One night, during a banquet much like the one you just endured, he sampled a venison pie and collapsed within moments. His lips turned black, his eyes bulged from his skull, and he died foaming at the mouth before the king could so much as stand. They later discovered the pie had been laced with a lethal dose of monkshood. If Edmund had not tasted it first, the king would have shared his fate. Edmund's sacrifice saved the realm, or so they said, though I doubt he found much comfort in that as he lay writhing on the floor." Thomas swallowed hard, trying to push away the image of the dying man. "Then there was Margaret Hale," Alaric continued. "She was accused of conspiring with a foreign duke to poison the king. They claimed she had allowed the duke's agents to slip arsenic into the royal wine. Whether she was guilty or not, I cannot say. But I can tell you this. She was dragged into the courtyard, stripped to her shift, and hanged from the gallows as the entire court watched. Her body swung there for 3 days as a warning. Her family was cast out, their lands confiscated. Do you understand what I am telling you, Gray? If you fail, even by accident, the consequences will be severe. If the king dies, you will be blamed. Even if you had no part in it, they will call you a traitor. That is the way of things here. The words sank into Thomas like cold iron. He understood now, more clearly than ever, that his life hung by the thinnest thread. Each day, each meal, would be a test he could not afford to fail. He would either die from poison or live under the constant threat of false accusation. The king's safety was paramount. His own survival was secondary, incidental. When Alaric finally dismissed him, Thomas stepped out into the dimly lit corridor with the weight of his new reality pressing heavily on his shoulders. He thought of his family, of the modest home he had left behind when he joined the army, and wondered if he would ever see them again. He imagined their faces receiving the news of his death, whether from poison or the gallows, and shuddered. The next morning, Thomas's training began in earnest. He was instructed in the methods of identifying potential poisons, though the lessons were of little comfort. He learned to watch for discoloration in sauces, to sniff for the bitter almond scent of cyanide, to be wary of foods with unusual textures or flavors. Yet the truth was that most poisons were undetectable, especially when masked by the richness of the king's cuisine. The court's cooks were masters of their craft, and a clever assassin could hide a lethal dose in a dish so perfectly balanced that no amount of tasting would reveal it. He was also warned about the political dangers of his position. Do not linger near the nobles, one of the senior tasters advised him. Do not accept gifts or favors. If someone takes an interest in you, be suspicious. You are a convenient scapegoat, Gray. Remember that. If the king so much as coughs after a meal, they will come for you first. As the days passed, Thomas began to see the court with new eyes. The lavish banquets that had once impressed him now seemed like gauntlets of survival. Each dish that passed through his hands carried the possibility of death. He could feel the eyes of the courtiers on him as he worked, their whispers curling around him like smoke. He could not tell who wished him well and who secretly hoped he would falter. The king himself was distant, offering Thomas no more than a nod of acknowledgement at meals. To the monarch, he was a tool, nothing more. It was during one of these meals that Thomas overheard a conversation that chilled him to the bone. Two courtiers, speaking in hushed tones near the dais, were discussing a former taster named Lionel Kerr. They say he suspected a dish was poisoned and refused to taste it, one whispered. He begged the steward to test it another way. The king was furious, of course. He took it as an insult, a suggestion that his majesty could be made to wait like a commoner. Kerr was executed before the next sunrise. Thomas clenched his jaw, forcing himself to focus on the dish in front of him. There could be no hesitation, no refusal. If he ever faltered, he would be branded a coward or a traitor. The profession of food taster had emerged because kings could not afford to trust anyone. Not their cooks, not their advisors, not even their own family. Poison was too easy, too tempting a weapon. A rival could strike from the shadows, leaving no trace, and claim a throne without raising an army. The taster's role was to serve as the final barrier, the last desperate safeguard against invisible murder. It was a brutal logic, but one that had preserved countless monarchs over the centuries. Thomas found himself wondering how many tasters had died to maintain that fragile security. How many men and women had swallowed their last meal in service of a ruler who might not even remember their names. He thought again of Edmund Reeves, writhing on the banquet hall floor, and of Margaret Hale swinging from the gallows. He could see their faces as clearly as if they stood before him, silent reminders of what awaited him if he made even the smallest mistake. At night, lying awake in his narrow cot, Thomas imagined the poisons he might encounter. He pictured the bitter taste of arsenic, the burning of corrosive mercury, the slow paralysis of monkshood. He had heard tales of more exotic toxins imported from distant lands. Snake venoms distilled into clear liquids, powders made from crushed beetles that could stop a heart in seconds. The possibilities were endless, and the knowledge left him in a state of constant dread. Yet he had no choice but to continue. The king required protection, and Thomas had been chosen to provide it. Each day, each meal, he would stand at the edge of the abyss and hope that death did not claim him. The court would watch, waiting for the slightest slip, and Thomas would do his duty because there was no alternative. He was the king's meat shield, and his life, however precarious, belonged not to himself but to the crown. In time, Thomas grew accustomed to the rhythm of his work, though never to the fear. He learned to mask his emotions, to taste each dish with the same calm expression no matter what churned in his stomach. He learned to endure the whispers and the sidelong glances, to accept that his survival was a matter of luck as much as skill. And he learned, above all, that the royal court was not the grand sanctuary it appeared to be but a nest of vipers, each waiting for the chance to strike. It was this realization that hardened Thomas. The young soldier who had once dreamed of honor and service was replaced by a man who understood that survival required vigilance, caution, and a willingness to accept the unthinkable. He had seen too much already: the false smiles of the courtiers, the casual cruelty of the king's advisors, the indifference with which the lives of servants were discarded. He knew that he was alone, and that knowledge gave him a cold, grim strength. Still, there were moments when the weight of his position threatened to crush him. He would stand at the edge of the banquet hall, watching as the nobles laughed and drank, and wonder how long he could endure this life. He would remember the steward's words: "If you die, the king will live," and feel the bitter truth settle in his chest. He was not a man to them. He was a tool, a buffer, a body to be sacrificed. And yet, in the quiet of the kitchens after the feasts, Thomas could not help but feel a flicker of defiance. He would taste the food, yes, because he had no choice. But he would also watch and listen and learn. He would navigate the treacherous currents of the royal court as carefully as any of the nobles, because he understood now that knowledge was the only weapon he possessed. He would survive for as long as he could, even if the odds were against him, because he refused to be just another nameless casualty in the king's service. The profession of food taster had emerged out of fear, out of the relentless paranoia that haunted kings and queens for generations. But for Thomas Gray, it had become something more. It was a crucible, a test that would shape him into something harder, sharper, and more dangerous than the frightened young man who had first stepped into the banquet hall. He was still the king's meat shield, still the thin barrier between the monarch and death. But he was also beginning to understand that this role, for all its dangers, could give him a kind of power. If he could survive long enough, perhaps he might one day use it. For now, though, Thomas could only endure. Each morning he would wake, put on the livery of the royal household, and prepare to face another meal, another test. He would walk into the glittering halls of Windsor Castle with his head held high, even as fear gnawed at his gut, because to show weakness would be to invite ruin. And he would remember the faces of Edmund Reeves and Margaret Hale, the men and women who had gone before him, their lives cut short by poison or accusation. He would carry their memory as a reminder of the stakes, a reminder that in the royal court, the line between life and death was as thin as the edge of a blade. This was his reality now, and there was no escaping it. Thomas Gray was the king's food taster, the king's meat shield, and every meal was a step closer to the inevitable. Whether that end would come swiftly, in the form of a poisoned dish, or slowly, through the relentless erosion of his spirit, he could not say. All he knew was that he would face it, because he had no other choice. Thomas Gray awoke before dawn in a small, cold chamber tucked away deep within Windsor Castle, the pale light of morning creeping through the narrow slit of a window. The bed was nothing more than a thin mattress of straw laid across rough-hewn wooden boards. Yet it was now his home as long as he served as the king's food taster. He sat up slowly, his body still aching from the tension of the previous night's banquet, and reminded himself that there was no reprieve in this position. Today, he would begin his first full day in the service of King Edward II, a day that promised not relief, but the relentless pressure of survival. The king's meals, lavish affairs prepared by the most skilled cooks in the kingdom, would be Thomas's personal gauntlet, each dish a potential instrument of his death. The castle was already stirring with the quiet hum of servants when Thomas stepped into the chilly stone corridor. The kitchens below the great hall were alive with activity, the air thick with the aromas of bread baking, meats roasting on spits, and the tang of spices carried from distant lands. Yet Thomas found little comfort in the familiar warmth of the kitchens. To him, these scents represented danger. Every ingredient could conceal a toxin. Every dish could be the one that ended his life. The royal cooks gave him curt nods as he approached, though their faces betrayed little warmth. They knew what his position meant. A food taster was a necessary part of their world, but not one anyone grew fond of. After all, if Thomas were to die writhing on the banquet floor, his death would be a grim reminder of the fragility of their own roles. Breakfast was the first meal, and though it was smaller than the banquets Thomas had endured the night before, it was no less fraught with peril. The steward, Sir Alaric Hensley, was waiting for him in the kitchens, his bony frame hunched like a vulture's and his sharp eyes glinting in the torchlight. "You know your duty," Alaric said simply, pushing a platter of soft bread, fresh butter, and steaming mulled wine toward him. Thomas picked up the goblet with trembling hands and raised it to his lips, the spiced aroma filling his nostrils. He sipped, tasting the sweetness of honey and the faint bite of cloves, and waited for any sign of illness. He imagined arsenic burning its way into his stomach, monkshood numbing his limbs, or mercury coursing through his blood like a fire he could not put out. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours as he held himself rigid, forcing his body to remain still. Only when nothing happened did he nod for the servants to carry the wine up to the king's table. The bread and butter followed, then a dish of pottage made from oats and dried fruit. Thomas tore off a piece of bread, chewed slowly, and swallowed, his mind spinning with the knowledge that a single bite could be the one that ended everything. When the king's breakfast was finally deemed safe and sent upstairs, Thomas felt no triumph. This was only the beginning. There would be luncheon to test, and then the grand banquet at night, each one more elaborate and dangerous than the last. By midday, Thomas was growing accustomed to the rhythm of his work, though not to the constant dread that accompanied it. He stood near the king's dais as the midday meal was brought forth, the sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows casting jewel-colored patterns across the stone floor. Courtiers lounged at long tables, their voices a murmur of gossip and intrigue. The king himself, Edward II, sat tall and imperious at the head of the hall, his expression a mask of calm that betrayed little of the paranoia that surely plagued him. Thomas knew that the monarch relied on him, though Edward had spoken barely a word to him since his appointment. The king's gaze would flick to him now and again as if to remind himself that Thomas stood between him and an unseen enemy, but otherwise he was treated as part of the furniture, essential, yet invisible. The first dish of luncheon was brought forth, a steaming bowl of spiced soup, thick with vegetables and cuts of tender meat. Thomas stepped forward as the steward motioned for him to taste it, and the entire hall seemed to fall silent, hundreds of eyes watching. He dipped the silver spoon into the broth and lifted it to his lips, the sharp aroma of peppers and onions filling his nose. The soup was scalding hot, but Thomas forced himself to sip, the liquid burning his tongue and throat as he swallowed. Almost instantly, he felt a searing pain spread through his chest, followed by a violent cramp in his stomach. He doubled over, clutching his midsection, his breath caught in his throat. A shocked gasp rippled through the hall as courtiers leapt to their feet, knocking over goblets and platters in their haste. "Poison!" someone shouted, their voice high and panicked. Servants dropped trays of food and backed away from the table, as though it were cursed. The king's guards surged forward, their hands on their swords, while Edward II himself rose halfway from his seat, his pale face tight with fear. Thomas could barely hear them over the pounding of his own heart. The pain was excruciating, a fire that seemed to consume his insides. His vision blurred, and for a moment he was certain he was dying, that the soup had been laced with some unseen toxin. But then, as suddenly as it had come, the pain began to subside. He coughed violently, choking as his eyes watered and his face flushed crimson. The court watched, frozen, as Thomas straightened slowly, wiping sweat from his brow with a trembling hand. He managed to croak, his voice hoarse. It was only the peppers. There was a stunned silence, and then, like a wave breaking, the hall erupted into nervous laughter and muttered curses. Courtiers sank back into their seats, the guards sheathed their swords, and the king himself exhaled in visible relief. Edward II's eyes lingered on Thomas for a long moment, cold and appraising, as though he were measuring the worth of this man who had so nearly caused a panic. Then he sat back down, signaling for the meal to continue, and Thomas was left standing alone, mortified. The rest of the luncheon passed in a haze of embarrassment and tension. Thomas tasted each subsequent dish with exaggerated care, determined not to repeat his mistake. He sampled roasted game birds, boiled greens, and pastries filled with spiced fruits, each bite another reminder of the thin thread by which his life hung. The courtiers cast sidelong glances at him as they ate, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and disdain. Some seemed amused by his earlier outburst, while others looked at him with open hostility, as though his moment of panic had insulted the king himself. When the meal was finally over and the hall began to empty, Thomas slipped away, his heart still pounding. He retreated to the kitchens, where the servants were already preparing for the evening banquet. The steward, Sir Alaric, was waiting for him there, his arms crossed and his face set in a grim scowl. "You nearly caused a riot in the hall," Alaric said without preamble. "Do you understand what would have happened if the king had believed you were poisoned?" Thomas swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. You would have been dragged out and executed on the spot." Alaric cut him off, his voice as cold as the stone walls around them. "Do not think for a moment that your value to the king makes you untouchable. If you falter, if you cause unnecessary panic, you will be replaced. And you will not leave this castle alive." Thomas nodded quickly, his throat too tight to speak. "Good," Alaric said, his expression softening only slightly. "Now compose yourself. The banquet tonight will be even more dangerous. The more elaborate the feast, the easier it is for someone to hide poison. You will be vigilant, Grey, or you will not see the dawn." That night, the great hall of Windsor Castle was transformed into a spectacle of wealth and power. Tapestries hung from the walls, their vivid colors illuminated by the flickering glow of hundreds of candles. Musicians played softly in the gallery as servants carried in platters laden with roasted boar, glazed hams, delicate pastries, and towers of sugared fruit. The courtiers were resplendent in their finest gowns and doublets, their jewels glittering like stars as they mingled and whispered behind jeweled hands. Yet beneath the grandeur lay the same undercurrent of fear and suspicion that Thomas had felt at every meal. He stood once more at the edge of the dais, tasting each dish as it arrived, his expression carefully neutral. He bit into slices of meat, sipped from goblets of wine, and sampled spoonfuls of sauces, all while the eyes of the court bore into him. The memory of the spicy soup still haunted him, but he forced himself to remain calm, to chew and swallow without hesitation. He knew that any sign of weakness could be misinterpreted, and misinterpretation in this world was as deadly as poison itself. The dishes came and went in endless procession, and Thomas found himself moving almost mechanically, his senses numb from the constant repetition. He watched the king eat with apparent serenity, though Thomas knew that Edward II's outward calm was a mask, one cultivated over years of navigating the treacherous waters of the royal court. The king was no fool. He understood the danger as well as anyone, which was why he relied so heavily on men like Thomas. At one point during the banquet, as Thomas tasted a slice of goose glazed with honey and spices, he caught sight of a group of courtiers watching him closely from the far end of the hall. They were speaking in low voices, their expressions unreadable, but Thomas could feel their scrutiny like a physical weight. He wondered what they were saying, whether they were plotting some scheme that would involve him. He knew better than to ask. In the royal court, questions could be as dangerous as answers. The banquet stretched late into the night, the revelry growing louder as the wine flowed freely. Thomas remained at his post, tasting dish after dish until the final course, a towering confection of sugared almonds and candied fruits, was served. When it was over and the hall began to empty, he felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. He had survived another day, but he knew that tomorrow the cycle would begin again. As he made his way back to his chamber, the castle quiet now except for the distant echo of footsteps on stone, Thomas reflected on the precariousness of his existence. Each meal was a trial, each sip and bite a gamble with death. He could not afford to let his guard down, not for a moment. One mistake, one lapse in judgment could mean not only his death but the death of the king. In that moment, he understood more clearly than ever why the profession of food taster existed. The king could trust no one, not even his closest advisors or family. Poison was a silent, invisible enemy, and Thomas was the only barrier standing between it and the monarch. It was a role that demanded absolute vigilance, and yet it offered no reward beyond survival. As Thomas closed the door to his chamber and sat heavily on his narrow bed, he thought of the faces he had seen in the hall. The courtiers with their calculating smiles, the servants with their averted eyes, the king with his inscrutable gaze. He knew that any one of them could be the hand that delivered his death, and that knowledge would haunt him for as long as he lived. He was the king's shield, a man who must risk his life with every meal, and there was no escape from that reality. He lay back on the straw mattress, staring at the dark ceiling as the sounds of the castle faded into silence. Tomorrow would bring another dawn, another day of tasting, another test of his endurance. And Thomas Grey, though weary and afraid, would rise again, because he had no choice. Thomas Grey soon learned that life inside Windsor Castle was a paradox, a strange and exhausting balance between privilege and humiliation. On one hand, as the king's official food taster, he was granted certain benefits that most men of his former station could never have imagined. He lived within the castle walls, sheltered by its stone bastions, and he was fed from the same kitchens that prepared the king's meals, meaning his plate was filled with finer food than any common soldier or farmer would ever see in their lifetime. The bread was soft and fresh, baked daily. The meat was tender, spiced, and roasted to perfection. The wine and ale flowed freely, rich and heady. Yet all this abundance came at a cost, one that weighed on Thomas with every passing day. For while he ate well and slept under a sturdy roof, he was not treated as a valued member of the royal household. He was tolerated, necessary but unloved, and in many ways regarded as little more than another piece of the king's tableware, a spoon, a goblet, or a platter. He felt this most keenly when he moved through the castle's great halls and passageways, where the nobles and courtiers swept past him as if he were invisible. The men in their jewel-encrusted doublets and the women in their brocaded gowns would glance at him only to sneer or turn their faces away, the corners of their mouths curling in thin disdain. Some whispered about him as he passed, their voices low and mocking. The meat shield, they called him, or the king's canary, as if he were a bird sent into a poison mine to see if the air was still fit to breathe. Others did not bother with subtlety, muttering insults openly, questioning how long he would last before collapsing over the king's table in a fit of convulsions. Thomas endured it all in silence. He understood that his position, though vital to the king's survival, was one that set him apart from the others. He was not a knight, honored for his valor, nor a minister, respected for his counsel. He was a buffer against death, a man who absorbed the danger so that the monarch could eat in peace. In the eyes of the court, he was not truly a man at all, but a tool, necessary, yes, but replaceable at a moment's notice. If he died, another would be found to take his place, and life in the castle would go on as if he had never existed. The irony of his situation was not lost on him. The very act of preserving the king's life ensured that his own life was considered expendable. Each day, he tasted dishes that might be laced with arsenic or monkshood, and each day he survived only by chance. Yet there was no gratitude waiting for him at the end of those meals, no acknowledgement of the service he performed. The king himself seldom addressed Thomas except through the steward, Sir Alaric, who issued his instructions with the mechanical efficiency of a man who saw Thomas as a cog in a larger machine. The courtiers, meanwhile, regarded him as a curiosity at best, a source of grim amusement at worst. There was only one person in the entire castle who ever treated him with a measure of kindness, and that was Princess Eleanor, the king's daughter. She was a young woman of 17, tall and graceful, with the sharp features and keen eyes of her royal lineage softened by an uncommon warmth. Unlike the other members of the household, Eleanor did not avert her gaze when Thomas passed. She would nod to him in greeting, sometimes even offering a quiet word of acknowledgement when their paths crossed in the corridors. On rare occasions, when she was certain no one was watching, she would stop to speak with him, asking how he fared, whether the duties weighed heavily on him. These moments were fleeting and cautious, for Eleanor was no fool. She knew that her father's court was a place where even the smallest act of compassion could be twisted into scandal. But to Thomas, they were invaluable. Her kindness reminded him that he was not entirely alone in this cold, calculating world, that there was at least one soul within the castle who saw him as something more than a disposable object. He clung to those encounters as a drowning man might cling to a piece of driftwood, though he was careful never to allow his gratitude to show too plainly. He understood that Eleanor's position was precarious in its own way. She could not be seen favoring a man of his lowly station without inviting rumors that could damage her reputation. Still, her words lingered in his mind long after their conversations ended. He remembered the way she had spoken softly to him one morning, when he had been standing alone in the cloisters after tasting the king's breakfast. "It cannot be easy," she had said, her voice carrying the faintest note of sympathy, "to face death at every meal, knowing that one misstep could cost you everything." Thomas had managed a small, awkward smile, uncertain how to respond. "It is my duty, your grace," he had said at last, his voice low. "Yes," Eleanor had replied, studying him with those sharp, intelligent eyes. "But duty is not the same as purpose. Do not let them make you forget that you are more than the role they have given you." It was a simple statement, yet it struck Thomas with a force he had not expected. More than the role they had given him. It was a notion he had not allowed himself to consider, for to dwell on it too long would only deepen the sense of isolation that already threatened to overwhelm him. In truth, Thomas had begun to feel like a ghost haunting the castle, present but unnoticed. He lived among the nobility, yet he was not one of them. He dined on the king's food, yet it was not his to enjoy. Even the privileges of his position seemed hollow, for they served as constant reminders of the danger he faced. The fine meals he tasted could just as easily be the instruments of his death, and the luxurious surroundings of the castle could just as easily become the walls of his tomb. He would lie awake at night in his narrow chamber, staring at the ceiling as the wind howled through the arrow slits, and think about the fragility of his existence. One mouthful of tainted food, one sip of poisoned wine, and his life would end without ceremony. He would be buried in an unmarked grave outside the castle walls, and by the next day another man would be standing in his place at the king's table. It was a cruel reality, one that Thomas could not escape no matter how diligently he performed his duties. The disdain of the courtiers only deepened his sense of alienation. They would smirk behind their hands when he passed, whispering that he was a fool for accepting such a position. Some even seemed to take perverse pleasure in imagining his death, speculating about which dish might finally claim him. "Perhaps it will be the pheasant," one courtier had murmured to another as Thomas stood within earshot. "Or the sweetmeats. A slow death, I think, so the king has time to watch and know the danger has passed." Thomas had pretended not to hear, his jaw tightening as he moved on. But the words stayed with him, a reminder that he was not merely unwanted but actively despised. He could not help but wonder if some of these same courtiers might be plotting to poison the king themselves, hoping that Thomas would die in the process. The only refuge he had was in the fleeting kindness of Princess Eleanor. She never mocked him, never treated him as less than human. When she spoke to him, it was with a sincerity that was rare in the royal household. She once offered him a small token, a simple ribbon embroidered with her initials, telling him quietly that it was meant for good fortune. Thomas had accepted it with trembling hands, unsure whether to believe in such things, but grateful nonetheless for the gesture. He kept the ribbon tucked inside his tunic, close to his heart, a talisman against the constant fear that accompanied him. Yet even Eleanor's kindness could not change the reality of his situation. Thomas was a tool, a buffer against death, and nothing more. He was painfully aware that if he were to die, she would grieve only in private, if at all, for the court would expect her to maintain the same cold detachment as the others. He could not fault her for this. It was simply the way of the world they lived in. As the weeks wore on, Thomas found himself growing harder, his features taking on the same wary cast he saw in the faces of other castle servants who had long ago accepted their expendability. He learned to school his expression into neutrality, to show no emotion as he tasted dish after dish before the king. He spoke little and smiled less, for he knew that any display of vulnerability could be seized upon by those who wished to see him fail. Yet beneath the surface, a slow, simmering resentment began to take root. He could not ignore the injustice of his position, the way his life was valued only insofar as it protected the king's. He had once believed in the ideals of loyalty and service, but those ideals now seemed hollow in the face of the cold reality he endured each day. The castle, for all its splendor, was a nest of vipers, and Thomas knew that he would never truly belong. He often thought of Eleanor's words, "Do not let them make you forget that you are more than the role they have given you." But how could he be more, when the entire structure of his existence was built around his expendability? He could not leave the castle, his duty bound him there. He could not rise above his station, the courtiers would never allow it. And so he remained trapped in a gilded cage, a man who was not truly a man, whose every breath depended on the whims of those who barely acknowledged his presence. The days bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of meals and tastings, of whispers and disdainful glances. Thomas moved through the castle like a shadow, invisible except in the moments when the king's life, and his own, hung in the balance. He had fine clothes now, better than he had ever worn as a soldier, but they felt like a costume, a disguise that did nothing to change the truth of who he was. He could walk the corridors of power, yet he had none himself. The irony was cruel but undeniable. He lived in the heart of the kingdom's wealth and influence, yet he was powerless, disposable, a man defined entirely by the danger he absorbed. And though Princess Eleanor's kindness gave him brief moments of respite, it was not enough to dispel the cold knowledge that clung to him like a shroud. He was the king's food taster, the barrier between life and death, and in the eyes of the court, that was all he would ever be. At night, as he lay in his chamber with the embroidered ribbon pressed against his chest, Thomas would think about the life he might have lived had fate not chosen this path for him. He thought of the fields of his youth, the freedom he had once taken for granted, the comrades he had fought alongside as a soldier. Those memories felt distant now, fading like mist in the morning sun, yet they were all he had to remind himself that he had once been more than the role he now played. But each dawn brought the same reality crashing down upon him. He would rise, dress in the livery of the royal household, and walk once more into the great hall, where the courtiers whispered and the king watched from his gilded seat. He would taste each dish, sip each drink, and hope that this would not be the day his luck ran out. And when it was over, when the king had eaten his fill and the court had dispersed, Thomas would retreat to his narrow chamber, the weight of his existence pressing down on him like the stone walls of the castle itself. There was no escaping the truth. He was not seen as a man, but as a tool. A necessary tool, perhaps, but a tool nonetheless. And though he had learned to endure the disdain of the court, to hide the bitterness that burned quietly in his chest, Thomas knew that one day, whether through poison or misfortune or simple exhaustion, the life he clung to so tenuously would be taken from him. Until then, he would continue to serve, because he had no other choice. The day began like any other in Windsor Castle, with the endless rhythm of preparation for another royal meal. The kitchens bustled with a kind of anxious energy, the cooks shouting orders over the clatter of knives and the hiss of roasting meat. Thomas Gray stood in his usual place near the dais in the great hall, his face composed and blank despite the gnawing dread that now accompanied every step of his existence. He had learned, in the weeks since his appointment as the king's food taster, to adopt the expressionless calm of a man who had no expectation of surviving long enough to make plans for the future. Yet on this day, even that thin veneer of control would be tested, for death was about to reveal itself in a way Thomas had long feared and yet could never truly prepare for. The great hall was resplendent as always, its vast stone walls lined with banners bearing the arms of King Edward II. Candles flickered in iron sconces, casting a warm but uneven glow across the long tables set with silver goblets and plates. The air smelled rich and heavy, thick with the aroma of spiced meats, sweet pastries, and the faint, ever-present tang of smoke from the kitchen fires. Nobles gathered in small clusters, their silks and jewels glimmering in the firelight, their laughter soft and rehearsed, masking the constant undercurrent of ambition and suspicion. At the head of it all, seated on the raised dais, was the king himself, his regal bearing as much a shield as the guards who flanked him. Edward II was a man well acquainted with the dangers that lurked within his own court, though his outward demeanor gave no indication of it. He ate, drank, and conversed with practiced ease, never allowing the fear of unseen enemies to show. Thomas, however, had no such luxury. As he stepped forward to taste the first of the dishes set before the king, his hands trembled almost imperceptibly. He sampled roasted pheasant glazed with honey and saffron, then a thick stew of mutton and onions, followed by a wedge of soft cheese and a slice of dense, sweetened bread. Each bite felt like a test, a moment in which his life might be cut short by the malice of someone hidden among the crowd. But Thomas endured, chewing slowly and swallowing without hesitation, forcing himself to appear unflinching even as his heart pounded in his chest. It was when the steward, Sir Alaric Hensley, brought forth the king's goblet that everything changed. Thomas took the heavy silver cup in both hands, the engraved lions and fleurs-de-lis cold against his palms, and raised it to his lips. The wine within was dark and fragrant, with the deep, earthy aroma of a vintage that had aged for decades. He took a small sip, as he always did, letting the liquid pass over his tongue before swallowing. Almost immediately, he felt a searing pain ignite in his throat. It was as though he had swallowed fire. His breath hitched, and a cold sweat broke out across his brow. The pain spread rapidly, radiating down into his chest, and his vision began to blur. Thomas staggered, the goblet slipping from his fingers and clattering loudly against the flagstones. A collective gasp rippled through the hall as he clutched at his throat, his legs buckling beneath him. Courtiers scrambled back from the dais, their faces pale with shock, while guards rushed forward, drawing their swords. Someone shouted, "Poison!" The word echoed through the hall like a death knell, and in that instant Thomas believed with absolute certainty that he was dying. He collapsed onto the cold stone floor, his body convulsing as the burning sensation in his throat intensified. He could hear the chaos unfolding around him, the panicked cries of servants, the barked commands of guards, the hurried footsteps of men and women scattering to safety. But the sounds seemed distant, muffled by the roaring in his ears. He thought of Princess Eleanor, of the ribbon she had given him for good fortune, and wondered if it had failed him. He thought of the countless meals he had tasted, the fear he had endured, and how meaningless it all seemed now. His final thought was a simple one. He had done his duty. He had saved the king. But death did not come. The burning in his throat began to subside, leaving behind only a raw, acrid taste that clung to his tongue. His body, though racked with pain, did not succumb to the paralysis or the darkness he had expected. Slowly, shakily, Thomas pushed himself up onto his elbows, coughing violently as he tried to catch his breath. The hall had gone silent, the nobles and servants staring at him with wide, fearful eyes. Sir Alaric stepped forward cautiously, his expression a mixture of suspicion and relief. "It was poison," Thomas rasped, his voice hoarse and broken. "But it was weak." Murmurs rippled through the crowd as Thomas's words sank in. The king, still seated at the dais, regarded him with a cold, calculating gaze. Edward II gave a small nod, signaling for the guards to lower their weapons, but his eyes never left Thomas. The steward knelt beside him, gripping his shoulder with bony fingers. "You live," Alaric said, his tone neither congratulatory nor comforting. "That is fortunate, but it raises questions." Thomas looked up at him, his vision still swimming. "Questions?" he repeated, bewildered. "Of course," Alaric replied. "Who was behind this attempt? How did the poison enter the goblet? And perhaps most importantly," he leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "were you complicit?" The words struck Thomas like a blow. "No," he said immediately, his voice rising despite the pain in his throat. "I swear it, I had no part in this." But the steward's expression did not soften. He straightened, his gaze sweeping over the gathered courtiers. "Until we know more," he said loudly, "the taster will be watched closely. If he is innocent, he has nothing to fear. If he is not," he let the sentence hang, the implication clear. From that moment on, Thomas's world grew even smaller. Guards shadowed his every move, their faces impassive, but their hands never far from the hilts of their swords. The courtiers, who had once regarded him with thinly veiled disdain, now eyed him with open suspicion, whispering behind their hands as he passed. He could feel their stares like daggers in his back, could hear the venom in their voices as they speculated about his supposed betrayal. Some believed he had intentionally drunk the poison in a failed attempt to kill the king, hoping the monarch would drink after him. Others suggested he had faked the entire episode to gain sympathy or to mask a larger conspiracy. Thomas knew none of it was true, but the accusations cut deep all the same. He had nearly died fulfilling his duty, yet instead of gratitude, he was met with suspicion and isolation. Even the small comfort he had once found in Princess Eleanor's kindness seemed out of reach now, for she could not risk being seen speaking with him lest she too fall under suspicion. Thomas saw her only from a distance, her face pale and unreadable as she moved through the castle corridors surrounded by her attendants. Nights were the worst. Alone in his narrow chamber, Thomas would lie awake replaying the moment when the poison had burned its way down his throat. He could still taste it, bitter and metallic, could still feel the cold terror that had gripped him as he collapsed to the floor. He wondered who had tried to kill the king, and by extension him, and whether they might try again. He wondered, too, whether someone within the royal household wanted him gone not because of his role, but because he had become a convenient scapegoat. The castle, which had always felt oppressive, now seemed like a prison. Every glance, every whispered conversation felt like a threat. Thomas began to move through the halls with his head down, speaking only when spoken to, keeping his answers short and guarded. He knew that any misstep could be interpreted as guilt, and guilt in the royal court was a death sentence. Sir Alaric was relentless in his oversight. The steward questioned Thomas daily, pressing him for details about the assassination attempt, about anyone he might have seen behaving suspiciously, about any conversations he might have overheard. Thomas answered as truthfully as he could, but it was never enough. Alaric's cold, hawk-like eyes seemed to search for cracks in his story, for any sign that Thomas was lying. "I did my duty," Thomas said one afternoon, his voice shaking with frustration as he stood before the steward. "I nearly died protecting the king. Does that count for nothing?" Alaric regarded him with a look of mild disdain. "It counts for survival," he said curtly. "But survival is not proof of loyalty. Until we know who was behind the attempt, no one is above suspicion. Not even you." The words left Thomas hollow. He understood now more than ever that he was utterly alone. He could trust no one, not the courtiers who whispered in the shadows, not the guards who followed his every step, not even the steward who controlled his fate. Death could come from any direction at any moment, and when it did, there would be no one to shield him from it. As the days passed, Thomas became hyper-aware of his surroundings. Every dish he tasted was examined with meticulous care, every sip of wine scrutinized for the faintest hint of bitterness. He watched the servants as they prepared the meals, searching their faces for signs of guilt or malice, though he knew it was a futile effort. Whoever had tried to poison the king was clever, careful, and likely well-positioned within the household. They would not make the same mistake twice. The fear began to eat away at him, gnawing at the edges of his sanity. He jumped at sudden noises, flinched when guards approached too quickly, and found it increasingly difficult to sleep. His once lean frame grew gaunt, his eyes shadowed by dark circles. He could feel the weight of the court's suspicion pressing down on him like a physical burden, and he knew that if another assassination attempt occurred, he would almost certainly be blamed. Yet Thomas could not leave. His duty bound him to the king, to the endless cycle of tasting and waiting, of surviving one meal only to face the next. He was trapped, a man marked by suspicion and surrounded by enemies he could not name. The castle had become a labyrinth of silent threats, and Thomas moved through it with the wary caution of a hunted animal, knowing that one misstep could mean the end. He thought often of the moment when the poison had burned in his throat, when he had believed death was certain. In a way, that moment had been easier than the days that followed. At least then he had known what he was facing. Now, he lived in a state of constant uncertainty, wondering not if, but when the next attempt would come. The ribbon Princess Eleanor had given him was still tucked inside his tunic, though Thomas no longer believed in its promise of good fortune. It felt instead like a reminder of what he had lost, the small shred of human connection that had once made his existence bearable. Now he was watched too closely to risk speaking with her, and he doubted she would wish to be seen with him even if he could. In the stillness of the night, when the castle was silent and the shadows seemed to close in around him, Thomas would sometimes imagine what it would be like to simply walk away, to slip out through the gates under cover of darkness, to leave behind the poisoned chalices and the whispering courtiers and the ever-present threat of death. But he knew it was impossible. He was bound to the king, and the king's enemies would pursue him no matter where he fled. So he stayed. He rose each morning, donned the livery of the royal household, and walked into the great hall with his head held high, though his heart was heavy with dread. He tasted each dish, sipped each drink, and prayed silently that he would live to see another day. And when the meals ended and the court dispersed, Thomas would retreat once more to his narrow chamber, the walls closing in around him, knowing that death could strike from any direction, and that when it did, no one would mourn his passing. The assassination attempt had changed everything. It had stripped away the last vestiges of security Thomas had clung to and left him exposed, isolated, and utterly alone. He understood now that he was not merely a tool but a marked man, a scapegoat waiting for the next crisis to claim him. And though he fought to maintain his composure, to perform his duties with the same stoic discipline as before, he could not shake the gnawing certainty that his days were numbered. For Thomas Gray, death was no longer an abstract fear. It was a constant presence, a shadow that followed him through the corridors of Windsor Castle, whispering in his ear with every step he took. And though he did not know when or how it would come, he knew it would find him eventually. In the royal court, death could come from any direction, and Thomas was left with the grim understanding that when it did, he would face it alone. Windsor Castle, for all its majesty and splendor, had always been a place of whispers, a grand stone labyrinth where power and ambition coiled like snakes in the dark. But after the failed poisoning attempt that had nearly claimed Thomas Gray's life, those whispers became louder, sharper, and more venomous than ever before. The great halls and echoing corridors were thick with speculation, each murmur hinting at treachery, each sidelong glance carrying the unspoken question of who had sought to kill King Edward II. Some said it had been a plot by foreign agents, their motives cloaked in the intricate politics of alliances and rivalries. Others insisted it was a scheme born from within the royal household, an act of betrayal by someone close enough to the king to slip poison into his wine. And increasingly, a name began to rise to the surface of these clandestine conversations: Lord Somerset. Lord Edward Somerset was a man who exuded the kind of quiet, predatory confidence that only came from decades of surviving and thriving in the cutthroat world of court politics. He was tall and lean, his angular features sharpened by age rather than softened, his piercing eyes scanning every room with the cold calculation of a hawk searching for prey. His voice, when he chose to use it, was low and deliberate, every word chosen with surgical precision. Somerset was known to be immensely wealthy, his lands stretching across half the kingdom, and his influence at court rivaled even that of the king's most trusted advisors. But it was not his wealth or his titles that made the courtiers fear him. It was the way he could destroy a man without ever lifting a finger, the way he could make enemies simply disappear, their names spoken only in hushed tones afterward, as if they had never truly existed. Rumors swirled that Somerset had orchestrated the failed assassination, though no one dared confront him. It was whispered that he had grown dissatisfied with King Edward II's rule, that he believed the monarch too weak and indecisive to hold the realm together in such turbulent times. Some said Somerset sought to place his own bloodline closer to the throne, perhaps through a marriage alliance or by supporting a rival claimant. Others suggested darker motives, that Somerset simply desired chaos, for in chaos men like him thrived. Whatever the truth, the mere suggestion that he had been behind the poison sent ripples of dread through the royal household. No one spoke his name aloud in the king's presence, and even among the servants his shadow seemed to stretch long and heavy, silencing conversations mid-sentence when he passed. Thomas Grey, still reeling from the suspicion that had fallen upon him after the attempt, could not ignore the rumors. He had seen Somerset in the great hall during the fateful banquet, seated at the far end of the king's table, his expression unreadable as Thomas collapsed from the burning pain in his throat. He remembered the way Somerset had watched him with those sharp, hawk-like eyes, the faintest twitch of his lips betraying something that might have been amusement or merely curiosity. Thomas could not be certain, but the memory left a cold weight in his gut. Somerset was the kind of man who could arrange an assassination without ever dirtying his own hands, who could manipulate others into carrying out his will while he remained untouchable. Yet Thomas also knew that confronting Somerset, even privately, was unthinkable. He was still under suspicion himself, still followed by guards who shadowed his every move and scrutinized his every gesture, as though he might suddenly reveal himself to be a traitor. He had no allies within the court who could be trusted. Even Princess Eleanor, the one person who had once shown him kindness, kept her distance now, her smiles fleeting and cautious when their eyes met across the hall. If Thomas accused Somerset and could not prove it, the accusation would be twisted against him, and his life would end not at the banquet table, but at the gallows. The court was a nest of vipers, and Thomas knew he was trapped in its center, forced to tread carefully with each step lest he provoke a fatal strike. He began to notice the way the courtiers gravitated towards Somerset, the way their voices dropped when he entered a room, the way they sought his favor with nervous smiles and carefully chosen words. Somerset, for his part, seemed to revel in the attention, accepting their deference with the faintest of nods, as though granting a favor simply by acknowledging their existence. He moved through the castle like a shadow, never hurried, never flustered. His presence felt even when he was not physically in the room. Thomas overheard more than one whispered conversation, suggesting that another attempt on the king's life was inevitable. The poison was weak last time. One courtier murmured behind a half-closed door, unaware that Thomas was passing nearby. Whoever was behind it will not make the same mistake again. Another, speaking to a companion in the cloisters, said, "If it is Somerset, he will not stop until he succeeds. He has too much to gain and too little to fear." These words chilled Thomas to his core, for he knew they were true. He also knew what they meant for him. As the king's food taster, Thomas would once again be the first to taste any dish set before Edward II at the next royal banquet. The memory of the burning poison still haunted him, the way it had scorched his throat and left him gasping for breath on the cold stone floor. He remembered how certain he had been that he was dying, how the faces of the courtiers had blurred together in a haze of fear and fascination as they watched him writhe. And now, as he considered the likelihood of another attempt, he understood that next time the poison would not be weak. The knowledge gnawed at him relentlessly in the days leading up to the banquet. He could not eat without imagining the bitterness of arsenic in every bite, could not drink without tasting the metallic tang of death in every sip. Sleep became a torment of restless tossing, his dreams filled with visions of collapsing at the king's table, of the courtiers stepping over his convulsing body, as though it were an inconvenience. When he did manage to drift into slumber, he awoke drenched in sweat, clutching at his throat as if he could still feel the phantom burn of the poison. Thomas began to watch everyone around him with a wary, hunted look, searching for signs of guilt or malice. The servants in the kitchens, the stewards who carried the dishes to the hall, the guards stationed at the door, all could be suspects. Yet he knew that if Somerset was truly behind the conspiracy, the plot would be orchestrated with such meticulous care that he would see nothing until it was too late. The court, with its layers of ceremony and protocol, provided the perfect cover for assassination. Dishes passed through countless hands before they reached the king's table, and even the slightest lapse in vigilance could be exploited. The day of the banquet arrived, and the castle was abuzz with a nervous energy that Thomas could feel in his bones. The great hall had been decorated for the occasion, its banners freshly hung, its chandeliers gleaming with polished metal. The long tables were laden with the finest dishes the royal kitchens could produce. Roasted swans with their feathers reattached for display, glazed hams studded with cloves, pies stuffed with exotic fruits and spices imported from distant lands. Musicians played softly in the gallery above, their melodies barely audible over the hum of conversation. Thomas stood at the edge of the dais, his hands clasped behind his back to conceal their trembling. The king sat in his gilded chair, outwardly serene as he conversed with the nobles at his table. But Thomas could see the faint tightness around Edward II's eyes, the way he glanced at the goblets and platters as though they might betray him. The king knew, as Thomas did, that danger lurked unseen in the room, that another attempt on his life could come at any moment. The first course was brought forth, and Thomas stepped forward, his heart hammering in his chest. He took the silver spoon offered by the steward and sampled the soup, a rich broth flavored with saffron and ginger. He chewed slowly, swallowing with effort, and waited for the telltale burn of poison. When none came, he nodded for the dish to be served to the king. The next course was roasted pheasant, its skin crisp and golden, the meat tender and fragrant. Thomas cut a small piece and brought it to his lips, the taste of herbs and butter filling his mouth. Again he waited, his eyes darting to the faces of the courtiers who watched him with rapt attention. Again, nothing happened. And so it continued, course after course, Thomas tasting each dish before it reached the king's table, each time bracing himself for the agony that might follow. He could feel Somerset's gaze on him from across the hall, the lord's expression as inscrutable as ever. It was a look that seemed to say, "I can end you whenever I choose." By the time the final course was served, Thomas's nerves were frayed to the breaking point. He tasted the sugared almonds and candied fruits with a kind of numb resignation, knowing that if he had survived this long it was likely only because the conspirators were waiting for the perfect moment. Perhaps they would strike at the next banquet, or the one after that. Perhaps they would wait until Thomas's guard was lowered, until he had begun to believe he was safe. But Thomas knew better than to believe in safety. He had seen too much, endured too much, to harbor any illusions about the nature of the court. It was a place where alliances shifted like sand, where smiles concealed daggers and kindness was a luxury no one could afford. Death could come from any direction, at any time, and he was the first line of defense against it, a line that could be erased with a single drop of poison. As the banquet drew to a close and the courtiers began to disperse, Thomas remained at his post, his face a mask of calm even as his thoughts churned with fear and uncertainty. He knew that the attempt on the king's life had not been the last, that the conspirators would not rest until they had achieved their goal. And he knew, with a cold clarity that settled like lead in his stomach, that he would once again be the one to taste first, the one to put his life on the line so that Edward II might live. He left the great hall that night with the image of Somerset burned into his mind, the lord's thin smile and watchful eyes a reminder that danger was never far away. Thomas could not predict when the next attempt would come, but he could feel it looming like a storm on the horizon, inevitable and inescapable. Until then, he would rise each day, don the livery of the royal household, and walk into the great hall with his head held high, even as fear coiled tight in his chest. For Thomas Gray, there was no alternative. He was the king's food taster, the man who stood between the monarch and death, and the court in which he lived was a court full of conspiracies. He had no choice but to endure, because to falter would mean not only his own end, but the unraveling of everything he had fought to preserve. And so he steeled himself for the days to come, knowing that the next goblet he raised to his lips might be his last, and that the shadow of Lord Somerset, and all that he represented, would be waiting for him, patient and unrelenting, until the moment came to strike again. By the time the weeks had dragged into months, Thomas Gray's role as the king's food taster had metastasized into something far larger and more suffocating than he had ever imagined. When he had first been appointed, he had believed his duty was limited to the meals set before King Edward II, the roasts and pastries, the soups and sauces, the wines and Alesh that could easily conceal a deadly draught of poison. But in the relentless paranoia of the royal court, there was no such thing as a clear boundary. Thomas's obligations extended far beyond food. He was now summoned at all hours to taste not only the dishes prepared for the king's table, but also the medicines prescribed by the royal physicians, the tonics prepared by the apothecaries, even the powders and ointments used to soothe the king's skin. If Edward II took a sip of a cordial meant to settle his stomach or applied a salve to treat a rash, Thomas was expected to try it first. He was the barrier between the king and any hidden threat, and there was no escape from this reality. The work was unrelenting. In the kitchens, he sampled mouthful after mouthful of the richest foods in the kingdom, swallowing each bite with the awareness that it might be laced with death. In the apothecary's chambers, he drank bitter herbal brews so foul they made his stomach lurch, each one potent enough to sicken him even when they were untainted. The tonics were especially treacherous, for the physicians believed in a philosophy of curing by purging, and their concoctions could leave Thomas dizzy and retching even in the absence of poison. He took the king's medicines on his tongue, enduring their acrid bite while the courtiers looked on with blank or amused expressions, waiting to see if he would collapse. He rubbed the king's ointments into his own skin, feeling the burning sting of camphor and quicksilver, knowing that if they blistered his flesh, the king would be spared the indignity of such a reaction. It was a cruel, dehumanizing existence, but the court had long since ceased to regard Thomas as a man. He was a shield, a filter, a disposable mechanism whose suffering was simply part of the cost of preserving the king's life. He was expected to work without complaint, without hesitation, and certainly without delay. Yet even the most hardened servant could not move quickly enough to satisfy the expectations of a monarch perpetually on edge, and one cold, glittering afternoon in the great hall, that truth became devastatingly clear. The banquet that day had been a display of excess even by royal standards. Windsor Castle's great hall was awash in light from the towering stained-glass windows, the flickering glow of hundreds of candles casting shifting shadows across the vaulted ceiling. The air was heavy with the scent of roasted game birds, honey-glazed hams, and spiced puddings. Nobles filled the hall with the rustle of fine silks and the murmur of polite conversation, their jeweled fingers tracing the rims of their goblets as they waited to be served. At the center of it all, seated on the gilded chair at the high table, was King Edward II, his expression a mask of imperious calm. Thomas, as always, stood just to the side, tense and ready as the first course was brought forth. The servants moved quickly, their polished shoes clicking softly against the stone floor as they carried in a steaming platter of roasted capon. Sir Alaric Hensley, the steward, gestured for Thomas to step forward. He did so, picking up the silver knife and cutting off a small piece of the bird's glistening flesh, raising it to his lips with the care of a man lifting a loaded weapon. He chewed slowly, conscious of the many eyes upon him, and swallowed. Then, as protocol demanded, he waited. But the king, impatient as ever, did not want to wait. "Faster," Edward II snapped, his voice carrying across the hushed hall. "I have no desire to starve while you perform your little ritual." Thomas's heart lurched, but he could not rush the process. If there was poison in the food, it might take several moments for the symptoms to appear. To serve the dish too soon could mean death for the king, and Thomas's own execution would surely follow. He bowed his head slightly in acknowledgement, forcing himself to maintain the same steady pace as before. The pause was too long. With a sudden, explosive motion, Edward II surged to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the dais. The hall went utterly silent. The king stepped toward Thomas, his robes swirling like a crimson tide, and without warning struck him across the face with an open hand. The blow landed with a crack that echoed off the stone walls. Thomas staggered backward, the taste of blood flooding his mouth as his head whipped to the side. Gasps rippled through the gathered courtiers, though none dared speak. They watched in frozen silence as the king towered over Thomas, his eyes blazing with fury. "You will not keep me waiting," Edward II hissed, his voice low and venomous. "Do you understand?" Thomas dropped to his knees instinctively, his cheek throbbing where the king's hand had struck. "Yes, your majesty," he said hoarsely, the words sticking in his throat. He could feel the eyes of the entire court burning into his back, could sense the smirks of those who had long despised him. The king glared down at him for a long, terrible moment, then turned sharply on his heel and returned to his seat. "Proceed," he said curtly, as though nothing had happened. Thomas forced himself to his feet, his hands shaking as he stepped forward to finish the tasting. He felt as though he had been hollowed out, his humiliation so complete that he could scarcely meet the gaze of anyone in the room. Yet he did what was required of him, cutting another piece of meat and raising it to his lips with mechanical precision. He tasted, waited, and nodded, his face a mask of compliance even as his mind roiled with shame. The rest of the banquet passed in a blur. Thomas moved from dish to dish like an automaton, sampling each one while the courtiers whispered behind their jeweled hands. He could feel their eyes on him, could sense their satisfaction at his public disgrace. To them, he was a figure to be mocked, a man brought low by the king's temper, a reminder that in the royal court no one was safe from humiliation. When the meal was finally over and the courtiers dispersed, Thomas retreated to the shadowed corridor behind the hall, pressing his back against the cold stone wall. His cheek was still swollen from the blow, and the memory of the king's fury burned as deeply as the physical pain. He understood, perhaps more clearly than ever, that he had no value beyond his usefulness. The king could strike him down at any moment, could cast him aside as easily as one might discard a broken cup, and no one would protest. He was utterly alone, trapped in a role that demanded his obedience, his dignity, and perhaps one day his life. In the days that followed, Thomas felt the sting of that humiliation in every interaction. The servants glanced at him with pity or disdain, while the courtiers looked at him with barely concealed amusement. Even Sir Alaric, who had never been warm, seemed colder now, his instructions clipped and impersonal. Princess Eleanor, who had once shown him small kindnesses, avoided his gaze when they passed in the corridors. It was as though the public slap had stripped away any illusion that Thomas was a man deserving of respect. He was an object, a tool, and the king had reminded everyone of that fact. The scope of his duties continued to expand. He was summoned to the king's chambers in the middle of the night to taste a sleeping draught prepared by the physicians, the bitter liquid coating his tongue like ashes. He was called to the apothecary's rooms to sample a new ointment made from ground herbs and mercury, its acrid fumes stinging his nose as he rubbed it into the crook of his arm. He was even required to test the perfumes and cosmetics used by the king, dabbing scented oils onto his own skin to ensure they contained no hidden toxins. Each task chipped away at his sense of self, reducing him further to a vessel for the king's survival. There was no escape from this reality. Thomas understood that any attempt to flee would be tantamount to a confession of guilt. If he were caught trying to leave the castle, the king would have him executed without hesitation. Even if he somehow succeeded, he would be hunted for the rest of his life, branded a traitor, and forced to live in constant fear. And so he endured. He rose each morning with the knowledge that the day might be his last, and he walked into the great hall with his head held just high enough to mask the despair coiled in his chest. He tasted the king's meals, his medicines, his tonics, his ointments, each act a reminder of his expendability. He did it because there was no other choice, because in the royal court survival was not a matter of strength or courage but of submission. Yet even as he bowed and scraped and swallowed the bitter poisons of his existence, Thomas felt something hardening within him. The slap in the great hall had humiliated him, but it had also stripped away the last remnants of his innocence. He understood now that he could expect no mercy from King Edward II, no kindness from the courtiers who thrived on cruelty. He was alone, and if he was to endure the endless degradations of his role, he would need to be as hard and unyielding as the stone walls of Windsor Castle. This grim realization settled over Thomas like a shroud as he continued his work. He no longer allowed himself to hope for kindness, no longer looked for moments of connection in the cold, glittering world of the court. He became quiet, watchful, moving through his duties with the efficiency of a man who knew he was living on borrowed time. But the memory of the slap, the sound of it echoing through the great hall, never left him. It was a constant reminder of his place, of the fact that in the eyes of King Edward II, he was nothing more than a barrier against death, a body to be sacrificed if necessary. And yet Thomas could not completely extinguish the flicker of anger that burned beneath his stoicism. It was a dangerous emotion, one that could not be expressed without sealing his own doom, but it gave him a kind of grim strength. He told himself that he would survive, not because the king valued him, but in spite of the king's contempt. He would endure the tastings, the humiliations, the constant proximity to death, because to do anything less would be to let the court break him entirely. In the end, Thomas knew there was no escape from the role he had been given. The castle was a cage, its walls lined not with iron bars but with duty and fear. He could not run, could not rebel, could not even protest when he was struck down in front of the entire court. All he could do was taste, swallow, and wait, hoping that each bite, each sip, each application of ointment would not be the one that ended his life. And so he continued, a man both visible and invisible, feared and mocked, essential and disposable. He was Thomas Gray, the king's food taster, the human shield who must taste not only the meals but every substance that touched King Edward II's body. There was no escape from this existence, and Thomas knew it would end one of two ways. In a quiet, lonely death from some unseen poison, or in the slow erosion of his spirit until there was nothing left but the empty shell of a man who had once believed he was more than the role he had been forced to play. The great hall of Windsor Castle was alive with its usual splendor that evening, a brilliant display of power and wealth meant to dazzle those who entered its cavernous stone chamber. Tapestries depicting long-past victories and saints' blessings lined the walls, lit by the flickering glow of hundreds of beeswax candles. The tables were laden with heavy silver platters filled with roasted meats, fruits, thick loaves of bread, and goblets brimming with deep red wine. Nobles in silks and brocade leaned toward one another, whispering in soft voices behind jeweled hands, their laughter rising and falling like a tide. Musicians in the gallery above played their lutes and viols with measured precision, though few were listening. The melody was little more than a polite background to the politics and intrigue that consumed the court's attention. Thomas Gray stood at the edge of the dais, his hands folded in front of him, his face an expressionless mask as he awaited the first of the evening's dishes. He had performed this duty countless times, yet the dread never eased. He knew that one day the dish he tasted would be the one that ended his life. But that night, the poison would claim someone else. The first course was brought forth by the servants, a rich stew of venison and herbs, its aroma filling the hall with the promise of warmth and sustenance. Thomas stepped forward as he always did, lifting the silver spoon to his lips with deliberate care. He chewed slowly, swallowed, and waited, his heart pounding in his chest. When nothing happened, he gave a brief nod to the steward, Sir Alaric Hensley, who motioned for the dish to be served to King Edward II. Thomas stepped back, his body tense as he prepared for the next course. Across the hall, another taster, a young man newly appointed to serve one of the visiting lords, was performing the same ritual. Thomas did not know his name. He had seen him only once before in the kitchens, a nervous boy with wide, darting eyes who moved with the stiff posture of someone unused to his role. The boy dipped his spoon into the stew, brought it to his lips, and swallowed. There was a brief pause, then a violent convulsion that startled the entire table. The boy's face turned an unnatural shade of red as he clutched at his throat, his spoon clattering to the floor. He tried to draw breath, but his chest heaved uselessly, the sound of his choking echoing grotesquely through the hall. For a moment, no one moved. The nobles stared in stunned silence, their faces pale, their eyes wide as they watched the boy collapse to his knees. He convulsed violently, froth spilling from the corners of his mouth, his hands clawing at his neck as though he might somehow dig the poison out. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the spasms ceased. The boy's body went limp, his head lolling to the side as the last breath rattled from his throat. He was dead. A ripple of whispers passed through the hall, but the reaction was subdued, almost detached. The visiting lord who had employed the boy signaled curtly to his attendants, who moved forward and seized the corpse by the arms and legs. They dragged it unceremoniously across the stone floor, the boy's head bumping against the steps of the dais as they hauled him away like a dead animal. The trail of saliva and vomit he left behind was quickly covered with rushes by the servants, who worked with the efficient indifference of men who had performed the task before. No one wept. No one spoke the boy's name. The musicians in the gallery faltered for only a moment before resuming their song. The same practiced melody they had been playing before the death interrupted the meal. The nobles returned to their conversations, their voices pitched slightly lower now, their laughter more restrained. But their attention quickly shifted away from the tragedy that had unfolded before them. Even the king appeared unaffected. Edward II sipped from his goblet, his expression unreadable, and gave a brief command for the second course to be brought forth. Thomas stood frozen at the edge of the dais, his stomach twisting in on itself as he stared at the dark smear left behind on the stone floor. He had seen death before, both as a soldier and as a taster, but the sheer indifference of the court chilled him more than the death itself. The boy had been alive only moments ago, his face bright with the flush of youth, his eyes wide with fear. And now he was nothing more than a problem to be cleaned up. The silence that had greeted his death was not the silence of reverence, but the silence of inconvenience. The collective pause of those who did not wish to be reminded of how precarious life could be. Will I die like that too, nameless and forgotten? The question burned in Thomas's mind, unbidden and unwelcome. He could see it clearly, his own body convulsing at the king's table, the same vacant stares from the courtiers, the same swift removal of his corpse. There would be no mourning, no prayers said for his soul. He would be dragged away, his existence reduced to a footnote in the ledger of the royal household. Another taster would take his place the next day, and the court would go on as though Thomas Gray had never lived at all. He felt his chest tighten at the thought, a suffocating pressure that made it difficult to breathe. He was already invisible to the courtiers, already a shadow that moved silently through the corridors, acknowledged only when his presence was required. But to die that way, to die without a name, without a single person to remember him, was a fate he could scarcely bear to imagine. The next dish was brought forth, a roast swan stuffed with fragrant herbs, and Thomas stepped forward mechanically. His hands were steady, but only because he forced them to be. He cut a piece of the delicate meat, brought it to his lips and chewed, the flavors of rosemary and thyme mingling with the metallic tang of fear in his mouth. He swallowed and waited, the seconds stretching into an eternity as he wondered whether this would be the moment his body betrayed him. It was not. Thomas nodded to the steward, and the dish was served to the king. But the image of the boy choking to death would not leave him. He could still hear the sound of his strangled gasps, still see the way his limbs had jerked helplessly as the poison coursed through his veins. He wondered what thoughts had gone through the boy's mind in those final moments. Had he begged silently for help? Had he cursed the role that had doomed him? Had he, too, wondered whether anyone would remember his name? As the banquet wore on, Thomas found himself scanning the faces of the courtiers, searching for any sign of remorse or guilt. But there was none. They spoke of politics, of land disputes and marriage alliances, of trade and war, as though the death of a servant was too trivial to warrant discussion. Some avoided looking at Thomas entirely, as if to acknowledge his presence was to acknowledge the fragility of their own lives. Others met his gaze with the same cold indifference they had shown the boy, their eyes flat and unfeeling. Thomas felt the weight of their contempt pressing down on him, suffocating him more than the fear of poison ever could. He had once believed that his role, though dangerous, carried a certain dignity. He was the king's shield, the barrier that stood between Edward II and those who sought to harm him. But now he understood that in the eyes of the court, he was no more than the dead boy had been, a tool, a disposable instrument whose worth was measured only by his ability to absorb danger. Later, when the banquet had ended and the great hall was empty save for the servants cleaning the tables, Thomas lingered near the dais. He stared at the spot where the boy had fallen, where his life had ended in a matter of choking, desperate breaths. There was no trace of the death now. The floor had been scrubbed clean, the rushes replaced, the air perfumed with burning incense to mask the stench. It was as though the boy had never existed. Thomas felt something hollow open inside him, a deep, aching void that no amount of resolve could fill. He thought of his family, the distant village where he had been born, the friends he had once laughed with around the campfires as a soldier. Would they even know if he died here? Would news of his death reach them? Or would his body simply be buried in an unmarked grave beyond the castle walls, another forgotten casualty in the endless struggle for power? He clenched his fists at his sides, his nails digging into his palms as he forced himself to take a slow breath. He could not afford to let the despair consume him. Not here, not in a court where weakness was preyed upon with ruthless efficiency. But the question lingered, haunting him with every step he took back to his chambers. Will I die like that too, nameless and forgotten? The answer, Thomas feared, was yes. In the days that followed, he carried the memory of the boy's death with him like a stone in his chest. Every time he stepped forward to taste the king's food, he could see the boy's face in his mind, the way it had twisted in pain, the way his body had crumpled to the floor. He found himself hesitating for the briefest of moments before lifting each bite to his lips, though he knew hesitation was dangerous. The king's patience was thin, and Thomas had already felt the sting of Edward II's hand when he had taken too long to perform his duty. Yet he could not banish the thought that one day it would be his turn. One day he would feel the fire of poison burning its way down his throat, his vision narrowing to a pinpoint as the world collapsed around him. One day the courtiers would watch him die with the same detached curiosity they had shown the boy, their expressions betraying neither sorrow nor satisfaction. One day he would be dragged away, his body discarded like refuse, and no one would speak his name again. The tragedy of his existence was not merely the danger he faced, but the certainty that his life held no meaning beyond its utility. He was a tool, nothing more, and tools were not mourned when they broke. Thomas understood this now, and the knowledge hollowed him out. He moved through the castle like a ghost, silent and watchful, his face a mask that revealed nothing of the turmoil inside. The courtiers whispered around him, their voices low and conspiratorial, but he paid them little heed. He had no allies here, no one who would care if he lived or died. He was utterly alone. And so he continued his work, each tasting an act of submission, each swallow a reminder of the fate that awaited him. He tasted the king's food, the king's wine, the king's medicines and tonics, because there was no other choice. He endured the whispers, the disdain, the cold indifference of a court that saw him only as a buffer between themselves and death. But at night, when he lay awake in his narrow chamber, staring at the dark ceiling above, Thomas could not escape the image of the boy's body being dragged from the hall, his limbs limp, his head lolling like that of a slaughtered animal. He could not escape the echo of the question that haunted him. Will I die like that too, nameless and forgotten? And deep down, in the place where fear and resignation mingled, Thomas knew the answer. The great hall of Windsor Castle, though resplendent with its banners and gleaming chandeliers, was an empty place when one considered its true heart. King Edward II sat at the high table, draped in velvet and crowned in gold, surrounded by the glittering ornaments of monarchy, yet there was a hollowness to the scene that no measure of wealth or ceremony could disguise. Courtiers filled the room, their polished faces turned toward him in practiced reverence, their voices carefully modulated to flatter without offending, to please without revealing. Musicians played softly from the raised gallery, their instruments weaving melodies that echoed against the cold stone walls. But even their song seemed insincere, a performance that carried no warmth. The king appeared every inch the figure of supreme authority, yet those who studied him closely might have noticed the small signs of strain. The stiffness in his shoulders, the wary flick of his eyes as he surveyed those gathered before him, the faint, tight downturn of his mouth that spoke of a man who trusted no one. Edward II understood better than most that power was a lonely throne to occupy. His court was filled with people, yet he was isolated in spirit, separated from the rest of the world by the knowledge that at any moment a hand might be raised against him. It was not that he lacked admirers. On the contrary, there was no shortage of nobles eager to bask in the glow of his favor. But admiration was a poor substitute for loyalty. He knew the language of ambition too well, had seen how smiles could mask daggers, how even family could be swayed by whispers of opportunity. He had lived through conspiracies and betrayals, had watched trusted advisors turn against him when the winds of fortune shifted, and he had emerged from those experiences convinced that the crown itself was a beacon that drew not love but envy. This understanding bred in Edward a profound paranoia that shaped every aspect of his life, especially the simple act of eating. A king's table, laden with delicacies from across the realm, was a stage upon which death could make its silent entrance. Poison required no army, no sword, no proclamation. It could slip unseen into a goblet of wine or a plate of stew and end a dynasty before the victim even realized he had been struck. Edward knew this well. He had heard the stories. Emperors felled by a single sip, dukes convulsing at their own banquets, queens wasting away from toxins delivered slowly over time. It was for this reason that, even amid the pageantry of the royal feast, he regarded each dish with a suspicion that bordered on fear. And it was for this reason that Thomas Gray, the king's food taster, occupied a unique place in Edward's life. Thomas was not a confidant, nor was he a friend. He was a barrier, a shield, a man whose sole purpose was to ensure that the king's meals would not also be his undoing. Yet in a strange way, Edward trusted Thomas more than he trusted anyone else at court. He had no illusions about the nature of that trust. It was born not from affection but from necessity, but it was trust nonetheless. Thomas had no power to threaten him, no wealth to challenge him, no ambition that could rival his own. He existed to die if need be, and that made him, paradoxically, the only person Edward could allow near his food without the gnawing fear that it might be his last bite. When the platters were carried into the great hall, Edward's eyes followed Thomas's every move. He watched as the taster sampled each dish, bringing the spoon or the goblet to his lips with the practiced precision of a man who understood the stakes. The court watched too, though their interest was less practical and more morbid. There was always the chance that Thomas would collapse in convulsions, and the courtiers, for all their feigned sympathy, lived for such spectacles. But Edward's gaze was sharper, more intent. He needed to see the reassurance in Thomas's survival, needed to know beyond doubt that the food was safe before he allowed it past his own lips. There was an irony in this ritual that Edward could not ignore. Here he was, the most powerful man in the realm, able to command armies and dictate the fates of nations. Yet he could not lift a fork without first ensuring that another man had risked his life on his behalf. Absolute power had brought him absolute vulnerability. For the greater his position, the more determined his enemies became. He could not drink from his own cup without the shadow of suspicion, could not trust a single morsel of food unless it had passed through the body of another. In the quiet moments, Edward wondered if this was the true cost of kingship, not the burden of rule or the weight of responsibility, but the knowledge that he could never again be at ease, never again break bread with others without wondering who among them might be plotting his end. This paranoia seeped into every corner of his existence. He kept his circle small, dismissing advisors who grew too influential, isolating himself from those who might one day betray him. Even his family was held at arm's length. Blood ties meant little when ambition could so easily sever them. The courtiers, sensing his mistrust, became more sycophantic, more eager to please, but their exaggerated gestures only deepened Edward's suspicions. He could see through the flattery, knew that behind the carefully chosen words and polished smiles lay self-interest. They would celebrate his triumphs while he sat upon the throne, and they would conspire to replace him the moment they sensed weakness. And so Edward dined alone in spirit, even when the great hall was filled with people. The courtiers sat at their long tables below the dais, laughing and whispering among themselves, but none of them truly shared the king's table. The food placed before him was his and his alone, the ritual of tasting a private dance between himself and Thomas that reinforced the invisible barrier between ruler and ruled. Edward would sometimes glance out across the hall and imagine what it might be like to eat without that barrier, to partake of a meal without the constant awareness that death could be lurking in the next bite. But such thoughts were fleeting, quickly smothered by the reality of his position. Thomas, for his part, understood that his presence was both a reassurance and a reminder of the danger that surrounded the king. He rarely spoke, his interactions with Edward limited to the brief nods and murmured acknowledgments that accompanied the tasting of each dish. Yet in those moments, a strange connection formed between them, forged not by affection but by mutual dependence. Thomas knew that his survival determined whether the king would eat, and Edward knew that Thomas's sacrifice was the only thing that allowed him a semblance of security. It was a bleak arrangement, one that neither man would have chosen, but it was unshakable. There were times when Edward felt the full weight of his isolation pressing down upon him like a stone. He would sit at the high table, the murmur of conversation filling the hall, and feel as though he were the only living soul in the room. The crown on his head might gleam brightly in the candlelight, but it felt heavier with each passing day. He could summon any man in the kingdom with a single command, yet there was no one he could truly confide in, no one whose loyalty was beyond question. The courtiers admired his power, but not the man who wielded it. They would grieve his death only insofar as it disrupted their own ambitions. This crushing loneliness was Edward's constant companion, and it was only magnified by the rituals that surrounded his meals. Each time Thomas stepped forward to taste the king's food, Edward was reminded of the invisible daggers pointed at his back. Each bite he took was an act of faith, not in the goodness of others, but in the belief that Thomas had done his job. It was a grim calculus, one that left no room for trust. Absolute power had given Edward everything that the world could offer: wealth, influence, dominion over life and death. But it had also stripped him of the simple comforts that ordinary men took for granted. He could not share a meal without fear. He could not look into the eyes of his courtiers without wondering which of them was already plotting his downfall. He could not even enjoy the taste of his food, for the flavor was always tainted by the knowledge that it might be his last. And yet Edward endured, because he had no other choice. The crown was not a burden one could set aside when it became too heavy. and he had long ago accepted that the throne was both his privilege and his prison. He wore his mistrust like armor, keeping those around him at a distance, even as it deepened the solitude he felt with every passing day. He trusted only Thomas, and even that trust was conditional, born from the practical necessity of survival. But in a court where betrayal lurked in every shadow, where a single sip of wine could end his reign, that sliver of trust was all Edward had. Thus the king dined, night after night, beneath the vaulted ceilings of Windsor Castle, surrounded by grandeur yet utterly alone. The courtiers toasted his health and cheered his victories, but their voices were hollow to his ears. He would glance at Thomas as the taster stepped forward with the next dish, and for a fleeting moment the loneliness would abate, replaced by the small comfort of knowing that at least one person stood between him and the grave. But as soon as the food was declared safe and Thomas stepped back into the shadows, the isolation would return, heavier than before. Edward II understood that this was the price of his position, that absolute power came with absolute paranoia. It was a lesson that had been carved into his heart by years of betrayal and fear, a truth that haunted him even in the midst of his court splendor. And though the great hall was never empty, though the candles burned brightly and the music played on, the king dined alone, his crown gleaming in the flickering light as a silent reminder of the throne's terrible cost. The day of King Edward II's grand birthday banquet dawned with the kind of oppressive anticipation that made the very air feel heavier. Windsor Castle was a hive of activity from morning until night, servants scurrying through the stone corridors with arms laden with platters, goblets, and fine linen, their faces pale as though they, too, sensed the undercurrent of unease that rippled through the royal household. Rumors had begun circulating days earlier that another attempt would be made on the king's life during the feast. No one knew where the whispers had started, but they spread like wildfire through the kitchens, the barracks, and the halls. Some claimed the plot had been hatched by foreign agents hoping to weaken the realm. Others swore it was the work of discontented nobles close to the throne. A few dared to suggest that Lord Somerset's shadow loomed behind the scheme, though none would utter his name aloud in Edward II's presence. Whatever the source, the fear was real, and it infused every corner of the castle with a restless, brittle tension. Thomas Grey, the king's food taster, felt it most keenly. He had endured countless banquets in the months since his appointment, but none had ever carried the same sense of finality as this one. The previous poisoning attempt had nearly claimed his life, and he had survived only by chance. Now, as he stood at the edge of the great hall watching the preparations unfold, he could not shake the certainty that his luck had run its course. He had tasted hundreds of dishes, drained hundreds of goblets, each time wondering if the next bite or sip would be his last. But this time felt different. This time the conspirators, whoever they were, would not fail. The great hall was transformed into a spectacle of royal opulence, its soaring ceiling lost in a haze of candlelight. Long tables groaned beneath the weight of roasted meats, fresh fruits, and sugared delicacies imported from distant lands. The courtiers, dressed in their finest silks and jewels, filled the chamber with the low hum of conversation, their voices pitched just high enough to mask the whispers of treachery. At the center of the dais, the king's chair gleamed like a throne, its gilded edges catching the light from the chandeliers above. Edward II sat in it with an air of measured detachment, his face unreadable as he surveyed the hall. He gave no outward sign that he was aware of the rumors, but his eyes were sharper than usual, darting from one face to another as though seeking the telltale signs of betrayal. Thomas remained close to the dais, his hands clasped behind his back to disguise their tremor. He had long since learned to keep his emotions hidden, to appear as impassive as the stone walls of the castle even when his heart was hammering in his chest. Tonight, however, that mask felt paper-thin. He was acutely aware of the courtiers' eyes upon him, of the way their conversations would falter when he stepped forward to taste a dish, their gazes lingering as though they were hoping, even expecting, to see him collapse. The memory of the young taster who had died choking at another lord's table haunted him, the image of the boy's lifeless body being dragged away playing over and over in his mind. The courses were served in a steady procession, each more elaborate than the last. Thomas moved from platter to platter, tasting with the same careful precision as always, his every movement watched by the entire hall. He sampled roast goose, almond tarts, rich stews simmered with wine and spices, and each time he survived, the tension in the room tightened another notch. He could feel it in the air, the collective expectation building toward something inevitable. Then the final dish was brought forth, and the great hall seemed to fall silent. It was an enormous cake, towering 3 tiers high, its white sugar glaze gleaming like marble in the candlelight. Fresh berries and candied flowers adorned its surface, and the faint scent of honey and almond drifted through the air as the servants carried it to the dais. It was a magnificent creation, a symbol of the king's wealth and the skill of his cooks. Yet to Thomas it was the most suspicious dish of all. Cakes were the perfect vehicle for poison, dense, sweet, and capable of concealing any number of deadly ingredients. Sir Alaric Hensley, the steward, stepped forward, his thin face grim as he gestured to the cake. "Taste it," he said, his voice low but carrying clearly through the hushed hall. Thomas's mouth went dry. He stepped forward, each footfall echoing loudly against the stone floor, and approached the cake. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room upon him. The courtiers, the servants, the guards, the king himself. The musicians in the gallery had fallen silent, their instruments held slack at their sides. It was as though the entire castle was holding its breath. He picked up the silver knife laid beside the cake and cut a small slice from the bottom tier, the blade sliding cleanly through the soft crumb. The piece fell onto a waiting plate, and Thomas raised it in his trembling hand. He stared at it for a moment, the sweet, cloying scent filling his nostrils, and then brought it to his lips. He bit down. The cake was moist and heavy on his tongue, the sugar and almond paste mingling with the faint metallic tang of fear in his mouth. He chewed slowly, his jaw tight, his throat working with effort as he forced the morsel down. And then he waited. The silence in the hall was absolute. The courtiers leaned forward in their seats, their faces pale and expectant, their eyes fixed on Thomas as though he were a condemned man awaiting the fall of the executioner's blade. Somewhere in the distance a candle guttered, sending a brief flicker of shadow across the room. But no one moved, no one spoke. Thomas felt his heartbeat thundering in his ears, the seconds stretching into what felt like hours. A bead of sweat rolled down the side of his face, tracing a path along his cheek as he stood rigid before the dais. He could feel the cake settling heavily in his stomach, could feel every flutter and shift of his own body as though it were magnified 100-fold. Was that a cramp in his gut, or simply his imagination? Was the faint dryness in his throat a sign of poison, or the result of his own fear? The king's gaze was upon him, sharp and unblinking. Edward II sat perfectly still in his chair, his hands resting lightly on the arms of the throne, his expression unreadable. He would not touch the cake until Thomas gave the signal, and Thomas knew that every moment of hesitation increased the tension in the room. He opened his mouth to speak, to deliver the simple nod or word that would release the king to eat, but no sound came. His tongue felt heavy, his throat constricted. He swallowed hard, and the movement sent a tremor of panic through him. Was it beginning? Had the poison already taken hold? He could not tell. The hall seemed to close in around him, the press of so many eyes suffocating. Thomas's legs felt unsteady, and he reached instinctively for the edge of the table to steady himself. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a collective intake of breath that sounded almost like a gasp. And then, the story ends here. No one knows whether Thomas Gray lived or died that night in the Great Hall of Windsor Castle. Some say he collapsed moments later, the deadly poison searing through his veins as the courtiers looked on in horrified fascination. Others insist he survived, that the cake was safe, that the rumors of another assassination attempt had been nothing more than idle gossip. There were those who believed that if Thomas had died, the court would have buried the truth to preserve the illusion of the king's invincibility, erasing his name from the record as easily as they had erased the names of so many other forgotten servants. But the truth is lost to history, swallowed up by the same silence that filled the hall that night. All that remains is the image of Thomas standing rigid before the king's table, the sweet taste of cake still lingering on his tongue, the weight of every eye in the room upon him as he waited for the first telltale sign of his fate. And perhaps that is the cruelest ending of all, not knowing. For in that uncertainty lies the lingering dread of a life lived entirely at the mercy of others, of a man whose existence was defined by a duty that could claim him at any moment. Whether Thomas Gray survived or perished, whether he was remembered or forgotten, we cannot say. But we can imagine the way the hall might have erupted in chaos or resumed its revelry, the way the courtiers might have gasped or sighed in relief, the way the king might have allowed himself a single, subtle exhale before lifting his fork. We can imagine, and we can wonder, and in the wondering lies the echo of Thomas's fate, suspended forever in that final, fateful bite. The profession of the food taster has always stood as a grim symbol of the fragility that lies at the very heart of absolute power. In the glittering courts of Europe and Asia alike, rulers cloaked in riches and armed with vast armies still trembled at the thought that death might be hiding in their next meal. It was a fear that revealed the great paradox of monarchy. Even those who wielded the power of life and death over millions could themselves be undone by a single grain of powder. A drop of bitter liquid slipped unnoticed into a goblet of wine. Poison required no legions, no open confrontation, and that made it the most insidious of threats. The food taster existed to intercept that threat, their body the barrier between ruler and ruin, their life quite literally expendable in the eyes of the crown. One bite, one life, that was the silent creed of the role, understood by all but rarely spoken aloud. For those condemned to the role, there was no illusion of dignity or permanence. A taster like Thomas Gray might dine at the same table as kings and queens, might taste the finest meats, wines, and delicacies of the age, yet they lived in a state of constant terror. Every bite was a gamble, every sip a test of fate, and at any moment their body might become the final proof that the monarch had been targeted. History is filled with examples of tasters who died this way, their deaths noted only as footnotes in the chronicles of royal intrigue. When a taster collapsed, they were removed as swiftly and coldly as any other piece of damaged property. Their names were seldom remembered, their sacrifices unmarked by monuments or praise. To the powerful, they were tools, necessary, yes, but disposable the moment their function was fulfilled. The rulers they served, however, were not without their own torment. Absolute power brings not only privilege but paranoia, and monarchs lived in a cage of suspicion as gilded as their thrones. They could never fully trust those around them, for history had shown that betrayal often came from the closest quarters. Poisonings were as likely to be arranged by family members, ambitious advisors, or former allies as they were by foreign enemies. This constant fear hollowed out royal courts from within, turning feasts into stages for silent duels of survival. Edward II of England, like emperors and shoguns before him, relied on men like Thomas Gray because he could not afford not to. Yet the very presence of the taster was a reminder that death lurked ever close. Kings dined alone in spirit, even when their halls were filled with the chatter of courtiers and the music of minstrels, because they understood that trust could be fatal. This pattern was not unique to England. Across Europe, the practice of appointing a taster was common, whether the ruler was a Habsburg emperor, a French king, or a pope in the Vatican. In Asia, the custom was equally entrenched. Chinese emperors in the Forbidden City relied on eunuchs and servants to sample their meals before they dared eat themselves, fully aware that palace intrigues often ended in slow-acting poisons. Japanese shoguns and feudal lords practiced similar precautions, as did Indian maharajas who lived in courts thick with rival factions. No matter the continent, the social hierarchy, or the degree of splendor, the dynamic remained the same. Those at the top were vulnerable, and those at the bottom were the shield. The profession, as cruel as it was, revealed uncomfortable truths about how societies functioned. It showed that even the most powerful could not escape the universal human condition of mortality. At the same time, it laid bare the expendability of those without status, whose worth was measured only by how effectively they could protect the powerful. The taster's existence was a microcosm of the larger world. A few lived cloaked in privilege but plagued by fear, while the many endured danger and hardship with little acknowledgement. The difference was that the taster's danger was immediate and visceral. Each day they woke knowing they might not see the next. Each bite was both a service and a death sentence deferred. And yet, the role of the food taster never truly disappeared. Though the methods have changed, the underlying fear has persisted into the modern era. Today, heads of state still have their meals carefully prepared and inspected by trusted security teams, and dishes are checked for tampering before they ever reach the table. The rituals are less dramatic, the science more sophisticated, but the principle remains the same. Those who occupy positions of extraordinary power know that they are targets. They know that an assassin does not always need a bullet or a bomb when a drop of poison will suffice. What has changed, however, is that no one in modern times must literally gamble with their life at every meal the way Thomas Gray did. Technological advances and strict security protocols have made the role of the human taster largely ceremonial in most places, a formality rather than a daily mortal risk. Yet the echoes of that older practice linger, a reminder that the fragility of power is timeless. The crown may have been replaced by elected office, the throne by the presidential desk. But the fear of vulnerability remains woven into the fabric of leadership. Even today, when a world leader lifts a fork, there is an entire unseen network of people and systems ensuring that what they eat will not kill them. The story of Thomas Gray, and of all those nameless tasters who came before and after him, offers a haunting reflection on the nature of survival in a world ruled by hierarchy. For the powerful, it underscores how easily their supremacy can be undone, how a single act of betrayal can topple a dynasty. For the powerless, it is a reminder of how often their lives have been used as buffers, their suffering overlooked because it served a greater purpose. The image of Thomas biting into that final piece of cake as an entire court held its breath captures this tension perfectly. One bite, one life, and the weight of a kingdom's fear resting squarely on his shoulders. We do not know if Thomas Gray lived or died after that last tasting, and perhaps it does not matter. His story, whether imagined or drawn from the countless real examples of tasters throughout history, embodies the truths that define the profession. It was a life lived in shadows, in silence, and in service to others' survival. It was a life that could end at any moment, without fanfare, without mourning, and without the world pausing for even a heartbeat. And in that way, the food taster's fate speaks not only to the past, but to the enduring fragility of human power itself. Those who stand at the top may appear untouchable, yet they live hemmed in by fear. Those at the bottom may seem insignificant, yet their sacrifices uphold the very foundations of rule. One bite, one life. The phrase belongs to history now, but its lessons remain as sharp and unsettling as ever. Once again, if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, so we have more motivation to produce better quality products. And now, good night.